I am Kendra, 35 years old, and my family has spent the last decade convinced my life is a pathetic failure. I sat silently on the scorching aluminum bleachers at my sister Jasmine's military graduation, sweating inside a fully buttoned dark trench coat. My parents sneered loudly, proclaiming I dressed this way just to embarrass them on their golden child's big day. They had no idea what was actually hidden underneath the heavy fabric. When Jasmine's fierce drill sergeant finally approached us after the ceremony, the arrogant smirks on their faces vanished. He stared at me trembling and shouted, "Wait, you are a general." The entire bleacher section went dead silent. Even my loudmouth father lost his voice. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your success while toxic family members tried to tear you down. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, my father Jerome, a retired postal worker, and my mother Yvonne, a woman who weaponized guilt like a professional, always made their preferences painfully clear. Jasmine was the prize. I was the disappointment. Today was the crowning achievement of their blatant favoritism. The Georgia sun was beating down mercilessly on Fort Moore. It was over 90 degrees, the humidity thick enough to choke on. Everyone around us was in light summer clothes, fanning themselves with graduation programs and complaining about the heat. I sat perfectly still, enveloped in a long, heavy black trench coat, buttoned all the way up to my chin. Yvonne leaned over her face, twisted in disgust, and loudly stage whispered that I looked like a deranged homeless woman. She asked why I always had to make everything about myself. Jerome chimed in, adjusting his cheap sunglasses, claiming I was deliberately trying to ruin Jasmine's commissioning ceremony because I was incredibly jealous. "Look at you," he scoffed, shaking his head with profound disappointment. "Your sister is about to become a second lieutenant in the United States Army, a real leader, and here you are, sweating like a pig, just to steal her spotlight." I did not blink. I did not react. I simply absorbed their insults with the practiced discipline of a military officer. Yvonne continued her tirade, raising her voice, making sure the families sitting in the rows nearby could hear every word. She proudly announced to anyone listening that Jasmine was embarking on a prestigious career while I was still stuck pushing papers at a dead-end government desk job in Washington, D.C. According to them, I was nothing but a glorified data entry clerk wasting her potential. I let them talk. I knew the heavy wool of the trench coat was sweltering, but it was absolutely necessary to conceal the crisp, immaculate uniform underneath. The silver star pinned to my chest felt heavy against my collarbone, a quiet, powerful reminder of exactly who I was and what I had survived to get there. The endless complaints from my parents were suddenly interrupted by a loud, condescending sigh from my brother-in-law, Liam. Liam was a 28-year-old white man who ran a failing defense contracting business, but walked around with the unearned arrogance of a king. He relied entirely on his retired colonel father's military legacy to act superior to everyone, especially me. Liam leaned back on the bleachers, stretching his legs and intentionally bumping my knee with his heavy boot. He reached into his designer leather wallet, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and tossed it right into my lap. "Be a good girl and go fetch us some cold waters, Kendra," he ordered, smirking at his own perceived cleverness. "I know your little data entry salary probably barely covered your gas money driving all the way down from DC in that beat-up sedan. Keep the change if you need it." Yvonne laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed over the noise of the gathering crowd. She patted Liam on the shoulder, treating him like a royal prince, gracing our family with his presence. Well, she reminded everyone, if Kendra had not dropped out of her traditional law program 10 years ago, maybe she would not have to count pennies to survive. She ruined her life, Liam. Not like our Jasmine. Jasmine made the right choice, marrying into your important military legacy family. The sheer disrespect from my own mother was a physical weight, but I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not defend the decade I spent building a deeply classified career that none of them possessed the security clearance to even hear about. As the youngest brigadier general in United States Cyber Command, I dealt with national security threats before breakfast. Handling the petty insults of a failing contractor and two emotionally stunted parents required zero effort. I smoothly took the $20 bill, stood up, and walked down the echoing aluminum stairs. My internal monologue remained strictly analytical. I viewed their cruelty not as a reflection of my worth, but as predictable, pathetic behavioral patterns of deeply insecure people. They needed me to be a failure, so their own mediocre choices felt justified. I walked to the concession stand, the heat radiating off the concrete pavement, taking measured, calm breaths. I bought 4 bottles of ice-cold water, carefully counting out the coins the cashier handed back to me. When I returned to the bleachers, I handed the bottles to my parents and Liam without a word. I looked Liam dead in the eye and handed him the exact change, down to the final penny. "Keep it," I told him calmly, completely ignoring his condescending sneer. "You might need it to float your company through its next failed security audit." He rolled his eyes, utterly missing the warning embedded in my words. He had no idea that my division was the exact government entity currently investigating his sloppy cybersecurity protocols. Before he could respond, the sudden commanding blast of a marching band cut through the heavy, humid air. The graduation ceremony officially began. The massive crowd erupted into deafening applause as the new officer candidates marched onto the pristine green parade field in perfect synchronized formation. Jasmine was somewhere in that sea of crisp uniforms, her chest puffed out, ready to be pinned as a brand new second lieutenant. My family cheered hysterically. Yvonne was weeping dramatically, screaming Jasmine's name as if she had just won a war single-handedly. Jerome was standing on his toes, filming everything on his phone, bragging loudly to the strangers sitting in the row in front of us about his hero daughter. They completely ignored my existence, treating me like a shameful ghost, haunting their perfect triumphant day. I stood silently in the back, the dark fabric of my coat baking in the intense afternoon sun. I watched the ceremony intently, my posture perfectly straight. I recognized the formations, understood the silent commands, and respected the intense discipline displayed on the field. But while my family was busy celebrating the absolute beginning of Jasmine's entry-level military career, I was simply waiting. I calculated the exact moment, the precise shift in the wind to let the decade-long facade drop. Jasmine was about to become an officer, but I was the one who commanded them. And very soon, this entire family was going to learn the difference between loud arrogance and quiet, absolute power. The heat of the Georgia afternoon was already suffocating, but the sheer toxicity radiating from my family made the air feel even heavier. I sat perfectly still, my posture rigid beneath the thick wool of my trench coat, while Liam decided it was his turn to perform for the crowd. Liam, my 28-year-old brother-in-law, possessed the unearned confidence of a mediocre man born on third base who genuinely believed he had hit a triple. He ran a mid-level defense contracting firm that was barely staying afloat, yet he carried himself like he was the Secretary of Defense. He shifted on the hot aluminum bench, his expensive aviator sunglasses catching the harsh sunlight, and let out a loud theatrical sigh. He acted as though simply existing in the same physical space as me was a tremendous burden on his day. Without looking at me, Liam reached into the back pocket of his tailored khaki pants and pulled out a designer leather wallet. He flipped it open with an exaggerated flick of his wrist, making sure the people sitting in the rows behind us could see the thick stack of bills inside. He dug past the hundreds and fifties, deliberately pulling out a crumpled $20 bill. He did not hand it to me. He did not ask politely. Instead, he leaned back, smirked at my father, and nonchalantly tossed the crumpled ball of paper directly onto my lap. It landed softly against the dark fabric of my coat, a physical manifestation of his utter disrespect. "Be a good girl, and go buy us some ice-cold waters," Kendra, Liam ordered, his voice carrying easily over the chatter of the bleachers. "Make sure you get the large bottles. I am parched sitting out here in this sun." I looked down at the crumpled bill on my lap, and then back up at his smug face. I did not move immediately, which only seemed to agitate his overwhelming need for dominance. He chuckled a cruel scraping sound and elbowed my father, Jerome. "Come on, Kendra, do not look at me like that. Liam mocked, his tone dripping with fake pity. I am doing you a favor. I know your little data entry salary back in Washington, D.C. probably barely covered the gas money it took to drive that beat-up sedan all the way down to Georgia. Keep the change. Maybe you can use it to buy yourself a decent outfit instead of hiding in that ridiculous coat. You look like you are about to rob a bank. My mother Yvonne immediately seized the opportunity to pile on. She had a sixth sense for recognizing when someone was vulnerable, or in my case, choosing to remain silent, and she loved to strike. She leaned past my father, her eyes narrowed with that familiar stinging disappointment I had known since childhood. You should be thanking Liam for his generosity, Kendra. She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. He is absolutely right. If you had not been so foolish 10 years ago, maybe you would not be relying on charity from your younger sister's husband. Yvonne was, of course, referring to my departure from the prestigious corporate law program I had been enrolled in a decade ago. To her, that was the ultimate betrayal. She had planned to parade my law degree around to her friends at the country club, a shiny trophy of her excellent parenting. When I quietly withdrew from the program to accept a highly classified recruitment offer from military intelligence, I could not tell her the truth. I could not explain the intense aptitude tests, the secret clearances, or the extraordinary path that had opened up for me. I simply told her I was changing directions. In her eyes and the eyes of the entire family, I became an instant, irreversible failure. A dropout who ruined her life and embarrassed the family name. Yvonne turned her attention to Liam, her face softening into an expression of absolute adoration that she had never once directed at me. We are just so incredibly blessed that our Jasmine made the right choices. Yvonne practically purred loudly enough for the surrounding families to hear. She did not throw her life away. She worked hard, and more importantly, she married into your incredible family, Liam. A true military legacy family. Your father was a colonel, and now our Jasmine is going to carry on that proud tradition as an officer. It just goes to show what happens when you actually have ambition. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Liam's father had indeed been a colonel, a man who built a lucrative contracting business on the backs of his old military buddies in the Pentagon. But what Yvonne and Liam did not know, and could not possibly comprehend, was that the very military legacy they were worshipping was currently crumbling under federal investigation. An investigation ordered and overseen by me. My cyber division had spent the last 6 months quietly dissecting the massive negligent data breaches occurring within Liam's company. I knew every failed protocol, every ignored security patch, and every lie his father had told the Department of Defense. I commanded the budgets that kept his entire industry alive. Yet here he was, throwing a crumpled $20 bill at my lap, calling me a data entry clerk. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not feel the sudden desperate urge to unbutton my coat and scream my rank into their faces. That is the difference between arrogance and true power. Arrogance, like Liam's, requires constant external validation. It needs an audience. It needs someone to step on to feel elevated. True power, the kind I had spent a decade forging in the absolute shadows of national security, requires nothing. It simply exists, undeniable and absolute. I viewed their cruelty not as a personal attack, but as a fascinating psychological display. My analytical mind, trained to identify patterns in global cyber threats, easily processed the predictable behavioral patterns of my family. Jerome needed to feel superior to mask his own mediocre career. Yvonne needed a scapegoat to avoid facing her own failures as a mother. Liam needed to belittle me because deep down, he knew his company was failing and his inherited legacy was a fraud. Jasmine needed me to be a loser so she could finally feel like a winner. They were all trapped in a toxic ecosystem of their own, frantically tearing me down to keep themselves afloat. I calmly reached down and picked up the crumpled $20 bill. I smoothed out the creases with slow, deliberate movements of my fingers. I stood up, adjusting the collar of my heavy trench coat, ignoring the sweat pooling at the base of my neck. I looked at Yvonne, who was glaring at me, expecting a temper tantrum or a tearful retreat. I looked at Liam, who was smiling like he had just won a war. I offered them nothing. No anger, no sadness, no reaction at all. "I will go get the water," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion they could feed on. I turned and began the slow walk down the hot aluminum bleachers. The metal steps clanged beneath my boots. With every step I took away from them, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp, focused clarity that always preceded a major operation. I was not walking away in defeat. I was strategically repositioning myself. My military training had taught me the value of patience. You do not strike when your enemy is expecting it, and you certainly do not strike when you are holding a weak position. You wait for the exact moment when they are blinded by their own hubris. I reached the concrete concourse beneath the bleachers, the shade offering a brief respite from the punishing Georgia sun. The line for the concession stand was long filled with proud parents and siblings wearing matching t-shirts celebrating their new soldiers. I stood in line, an invisible woman hidden inside a heavy coat. I thought about the secure briefing I had conducted just 12 hours earlier at the Pentagon, directing operations that protected the electrical grid of the entire eastern seaboard. I thought about the 4-star generals who stood when I entered the room. And then I thought about the crumpled $20 bill in my hand. When I finally reached the front of the line, I asked the teenage cashier for 4 large bottles of ice water. The total came to exactly $18. I handed over Liam's 20. I waited patiently as the cashier counted out 2 crisp $1 bills and handed them back to me. I folded the $2, precisely tucking them into my pocket. I would not keep his change. I would hand it directly back to him, forcing him to acknowledge that I did not need his charity. I gathered the cold, sweating plastic bottles into my arms and turned back toward the bleachers. The graduation ceremony was minutes away from starting. The trap was perfectly set. I just had to walk back up those stairs, hand them their water, and wait for the drill sergeant to walk across that field. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun, and I was going to savor every single second of it. I walked back up the sweltering aluminum stairs, carrying the 4 cold plastic bottles of water against my chest. The condensation was already soaking into the thick wool of my trench coat, but the slight chill was a welcome relief from the punishing Georgia heat. I reached our row just as the crowd began to settle into a hushed, expectant murmur. I handed the first bottle to my father, Jerome, who snatched it from my hand without breaking his gaze from the empty parade field. I handed the second bottle to my mother, Yvonne. She took it with a dismissive wave of her hand, already too preoccupied with adjusting her wide-brimmed sun hat to utter a simple thank you. Then I turned to Liam. He reached out a lazy hand, expecting only the water and the submission he felt he was owed. I placed the sweating bottle into his palm, and then I deliberately placed the 2 folded $1 bills directly on top of it. He looked down at the money, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "I told you to keep the change," he muttered, his voice dropping into a patronizing growl, as if he were scolding a disobedient child. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression entirely hollow of the intimidation he was desperately hoping to see. "I prefer to pay my own way," I replied smoothly. "Keep it for your business. From what I hear about the defense contracting market these days, every single dollar counts." Liam narrowed his eyes, his face flushing a deep, angry red beneath his expensive sunglasses. He opened his mouth to snap back, but the sudden booming crackle of the public address system echoed across the installation, cutting him off completely. The booming voice of the announcer welcomed the families and distinguished guests to the officer candidate school graduation ceremony. The distraction was perfectly timed. Liam shoved the $2 angrily into his pocket, muttering under his breath about my supposed lack of gratitude, and turned his attention to the field. I took my seat at the very edge of the bleacher bench. My family naturally closed ranks, shifting their shoulders inward to create a physical barrier between their joyous celebration and my shameful existence. It was a subtle, aggressive maneuver they had perfected over decades. In their minds, I was a dark cloud threatening to rain on Jasmine's golden parade. But I did not mind the isolation. In fact, it gave me the perfect vantage point to observe everything without having to participate in their exhausting theatrical display of parental pride. A sharp, authoritative command rang out from the far end of the parade grounds. The marching band struck up a triumphant brass-heavy military march that vibrated through the metal bleachers beneath us. Then the rhythmic, thunderous sound of hundreds of combat boots striking the pavement in perfect unison filled the air. The officer candidates marched into view, an absolute sea of pristine army green. The precision was flawless. Every arm swung at the exact same angle, every foot landed with devastating synchronization. It was a beautiful display of discipline and raw potential. The foundation of the very military structure I had dedicated my entire adult life to defending. I scanned the rigid formations as they moved onto the vast expanse of the green field. It only took me a few seconds to locate Jasmine. She was in the second platoon, third row back. Even from this distance, hidden beneath her cover, I could recognize the slight, arrogant tilt of her chin. She looked the part, standing tall in her freshly pressed uniform, but I knew the truth about my younger sister. Jasmine possessed the aesthetic of a leader, but she entirely lacked the grit. She had spent her entire life being coddled by Yvonne, and Jerome handed every opportunity and shielded from every consequence. She was about to step into a world that did not care about her golden child status, a world that would demand actual sacrifice. I genuinely hoped the military would finally build the character she was missing, but looking at my family cheering like maniacs beside me, I severely doubted they would ever let her grow up. Yvonne was putting on an absolute spectacle. She was leaning over the railing, waving a handkerchief, and screaming Jasmine's name at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring military decorum. She was sobbing theatrical tears of validation, making sure the families seated to our left and right knew exactly whose mother she was. Jerome was just as bad. He was standing up, blocking the view of an elderly couple behind us, aggressively filming the marching formations with his phone. He kept shouting that his baby girl was an officer now, elbowing Liam, and proudly declaring that the family legacy was secure. Liam sat back with his arms crossed, nodding with unearned authority, looking around at the other families as if he personally owned the military base, because his father used to be a colonel. I watched the ceremony intently, my mind effortlessly translating the spectacle in front of me into the tactical language I spoke every single day. I recognized the intricate formations they were demonstrating. I understood the specific cadence of the drill commands echoing from the parade field. I knew exactly how much sweat exhaustion and breaking down of the ego went into forging those candidates into a cohesive unit. I deeply respected the uniform they were wearing, which made my family's circus act beside me feel all the more offensive. They were treating this solemn commissioning ceremony like a high school pep rally, completely blind to the immense, deadly, serious weight of the oath Jasmine was about to take. As I sat there in silence, a profound sense of irony washed over me. I looked at the VIP box set up near the podium on the field. I recognized the base commander, a two-star major general sitting in the front row. Just 3 weeks ago, I had sat across a highly classified conference table from him at the Pentagon reviewing the cyber defense vulnerabilities of this exact installation. He had addressed me as ma'am. He had taken notes when I spoke. Yet here I was sweating in a heavy trench coat on the bleachers, being treated like a feral dog by a retired postal worker, an overbearing mother, and a failing civilian contractor. My family thought I was an ant they could casually step on, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the magnifying glass dictating whether they burned. The ceremony progressed with flawless military efficiency. The speeches were given highlighting duty, honor, and country. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. The candidates raised their right hands and recited the oath of commissioned officers. They swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I mouthed the words silently along with them, feeling the familiar heavy gravity of that promise. 10 years ago, I had taken that exact same oath in a quiet, heavily guarded room, committing my life to the shadows. Today, Jasmine was taking it in the bright sunlight, surrounded by applause and adoration. The final command was given. The newly minted second lieutenants ripped off their covers and threw them high into the bright blue sky. A massive roar erupted from the crowd. The band played a final triumphant song, and the rigid formations instantly dissolved into joyous chaos as families were finally granted permission to storm the parade field. Yvonne shrieked with joy, grabbing Jerome's arm. Liam stood up, adjusting his expensive collar, ready to go play the role of the seasoned military veteran welcoming the new blood. They practically trampled over my feet in their desperate rush to get down the bleacher stairs and find Jasmine. They did not ask if I was coming. They did not look back to see if I was following. They simply abandoned me on the bench exactly as they had done my entire life. I did not rush. I stood up slowly, letting the loud, frantic crowd disperse around me. I smoothed the front of my heavy trench coat, checking to make sure the thick black buttons were still securely fastened all the way up to my collarbone. I took a deep, steadying breath of the humid Georgia air. The waiting was finally over. The calculations were complete. I began my slow descent down the aluminum stairs toward the grassy field below. It was time to go hold my sister's bags. It was time to let Liam talk down to me one last time. And most importantly, it was time to introduce my family to the realities of the food chain. Stepping onto the manicured grass of the parade field felt like walking into a chaotic, joyous riot. Hundreds of families were sprinting toward their newly commissioned officers, carrying bouquets of flowers, mylar balloons, and giant cardboard signs. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass, expensive perfume, and the overwhelming, suffocating humidity of the Georgia summer. I navigated through the sea of celebrating strangers with measured steps, keeping my hands buried deep in the pockets of my heavy trench coat. Ahead of me, Yvonne and Jerome were aggressively pushing their way through the crowd, completely ignoring the polite excuses of the people they were shoving aside. Liam trailed behind them, looking around the military installation as if he were inspecting the base for structural flaws. They found Jasmine standing near the center of the field, surrounded by her platoon mates. Yvonne let out a piercing shriek that made several nearby military officers flinch. She threw her arms around Jasmine, sobbing loudly and smearing expensive makeup all over the shoulder of Jasmine's freshly pressed uniform. Jerome was practically vibrating with unearned pride, clapping his daughter on the back and loudly proclaiming to anyone within earshot that the family legacy had officially been secured. I stood a few feet away, a silent, dark figure, observing their theatrical display of affection. I did not interrupt. I simply watched the way Jasmine soaked up the attention, her chest puffed out, her chin tilted up with that familiar, sickening arrogance. "All right, everyone, gather around," Jerome bellowed, pulling his phone out of his pocket and waving it in the air like a flag. "We need to document this historic moment." "Liam, get over here next to your wife. Yvonne, stand on the other side. Let us get a picture for the family group chat so everyone back home knows what real success looks like." I took a step forward naturally, assuming I would at least be permitted to stand on the edge of the frame. I was entirely wrong. Jerome saw me moving into the periphery and immediately dropped his phone, his face twisting into a scowl of deep annoyance. He marched directly over to me, grabbed me roughly by the elbow, and shoved me forcefully toward the back of the group. "Get behind Liam!" Jerome barked, his voice dripping with venom. "You are wearing a winter coat in the middle of July, Kendra. You look absolutely ridiculous. You are a complete eyesore, and I am not having you ruin the most important photograph of your sister's life. Stand behind Liam's shoulder so the camera cannot see your outfit. Better yet, just step out of the frame entirely. We want this picture to reflect ambition, not failure." I looked at my father's hands still lingering in the air from where he had shoved me. A decade ago, that physical rejection would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. Today, it felt like nothing more than a mosquito biting the heavily fortified armor of a tank. I did not argue. I stepped directly behind Liam's broad shoulders, effectively erasing myself from the family portrait. I listened to the artificial countdown, the fake cheers, and the sharp click of the camera lens, capturing their perfect, fabricated reality. They took 6 different photos, constantly rearranging themselves to ensure Jasmine was the absolute center of the universe. Not once did any of them ask me to step into the light. When the impromptu photo shoot finally concluded, Jasmine broke away from Yvonne's suffocating embrace and turned her attention to me. She looked me up and down, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in a look of profound disgust. The silver bars of a second lieutenant gleamed brightly on her collar, but her eyes held the exact same petty cruelty they had when we were teenagers fighting over bathroom space. "Are you genuinely trying to sweat to death?" Kendra Jasmine asked, her voice carrying that sharp, mocking tone that always guaranteed a laugh from our parents. "Or did you just wear that hideous coat to draw attention away from me? You know it is incredibly pathetic that you cannot even let me have one single day of glory without trying to make yourself the absolute victim. You look like you are hiding stolen merchandise under there." Yvonne let out a loud, grating laugh, completely validating Jasmine's disrespect. Liam smirked, adjusting his sunglasses and crossing his arms across his chest. I stared at Jasmine, analyzing the sheer insecurity radiating from her entire posture. She had just achieved a major milestone, yet her very first instinct was to tear me down. She desperately needed me to be small so she could feel big. "I am not trying to steal your spotlight, Jasmine," I replied calmly, keeping my voice perfectly steady and entirely devoid of the emotion she was trying to provoke. "I am simply wearing what I chose to wear. Congratulations on your commission." Jasmine rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that I had not reacted with the defensive anger she was hunting for. She reached down and grabbed the handle of a massive, heavily overstuffed olive-drab military duffel bag resting on the grass. Without a single word of warning, she hoisted it up and dropped it directly onto the toes of my combat boots. The heavy canvas hit the ground with a loud thud, raising a small cloud of dry dirt. "Since you clearly are not going to be in any more of the pictures you can make yourself useful for once," Jasmine ordered, gesturing lazily toward the dirt-covered bag. "Carry my gear to Liam's car. The parking lot is about a half-mile that way. Try not to drag it on the concrete. I do not want the fabric tearing because you are too weak to hold it up." Jerome nodded in agreement, completely unfazed by his youngest daughter treating his eldest daughter like an indentured servant. "It is the absolute least you can do, Kendra," he added, crossing his arms. "You have contributed absolutely nothing to this family all day. Carry your sister's bag and stop complaining." I looked down at the massive duffel bag resting heavily against my boots. I knew exactly how much gear was packed inside that canvas sack. It easily weighed 60 pounds, packed tight with extra boots, heavy uniforms, and tactical equipment. To an average civilian pushing papers at a desk job, lifting and carrying that bag for half a mile in the sweltering heat would be a grueling, humiliating punishment designed to break their spirit. But I was not an average civilian. I ran 5 miles every single morning before the sun even came up. I trained alongside elite cyber warfare operators and maintained the exact same physical readiness standards as the combat soldiers deployed in active war zones. I leaned down and grabbed the thick canvas straps of the duffel bag. I lifted it off the ground in one smooth, effortless motion, slinging it over my right shoulder, as if it weighed no more than a light purse. I did not grunt. I did not struggle. The heavy weight settled comfortably against the thick wool of my trench coat. Jasmine looked slightly taken aback by the sheer ease with which I handled the heavy load, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second, but she quickly masked her surprise with another arrogant sneer. "Just follow behind us," Jasmine commanded, turning her back to me and linking her arm through Liam's. "And keep up. We have a reservation at an expensive steakhouse that I am absolutely starving for. I am sure you can just order a side salad or something you can actually afford." As my family began to walk away, assuming I would obediently trail behind them like a loyal pack mule, I remained planted precisely where I was standing. I adjusted the thick strap of the heavy bag on my shoulder, but my eyes were no longer focused on my sister or my parents. I was looking directly past them, staring at a figure moving with intense predatory purpose across the manicured turf. He was a tall, heavily muscled African-American man wearing the iconic round brown campaign hat of a United States Army drill sergeant. His uniform was pressed to absolute perfection, the creases sharp enough to draw blood. I recognized the fierce, unyielding stride of a man who spent his life breaking down arrogant recruits and forging them into disciplined soldiers. It was Sergeant First Class Mitchell, the senior drill instructor for Jasmine's company. He was navigating through the massive crowds of celebrating families, his eyes scanning the area with incredible focus. I watched Liam spot the drill sergeant approaching. Liam's posture instantly changed. He puffed out his chest, completely abandoning his wife's side, and stepped forward to intercept the incoming soldier. Liam was practically vibrating with the arrogant excitement of a white man ready to use his father's retired military rank to secure an unearned favor from a black non-commissioned officer. I remained completely silent, holding the heavy duffel bag on my shoulder, the intense Georgia sun beating down on my dark trench coat. The stage was finally set. The players were perfectly positioned. The absolute destruction of my family's illusion of superiority was merely seconds away. Liam stopped dead in his tracks, his expensive leather loafers digging into the freshly cut grass. He let go of Jasmine's arm, completely abandoning his wife the second he saw a chance to elevate his own ego. "Look who is heading this way," Liam announced, his voice practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. Jerome turned, squinting through the harsh sunlight to follow Liam's gaze. "That is Sergeant First Class Mitchell." Liam continued, puffing his chest out so far it strained the buttons of his tailored polo shirt. "He is the senior drill instructor for Jasmine's company. I recognize him from the orientation pamphlets. This is perfect. Watch and learn, Jerome. I am going to secure our girl a fast-track commendation before we even leave this base." Yvonne gasped with delight, clasping her hands together as if Liam were performing a miracle. "Oh, Liam, you are just wonderful," she cooed, entirely forgetting that I was standing right behind them, holding 60 pounds of military gear. Jerome nodded vigorously, his chest swelling with second-hand pride. "That is what a real military legacy can do," Jerome declared loudly, making sure the surrounding families heard him. "It is all about who you know. Go get him, son." Liam adjusted his aviator sunglasses, a wide, predatory smile spreading across his face. He rolled his shoulders back, adopting the swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire installation. "My father, Colonel Richard Vance, still has a lot of pull in these circles," Liam bragged, taking a few steps forward to position himself directly in the drill sergeant's path. "These career non-commissioned officers absolutely worship the old guard. I just need to drop the old man's name, and this sergeant will practically be kissing my boots." Jasmine beamed, her earlier annoyance completely erased by the prospect of an unearned advantage. She smoothed down her fresh uniform, preparing to play the role of the humble, deserving legacy officer. I stood completely still, the heavy canvas strap of the duffel bag digging into my shoulder. I watched Liam prepare for his grand performance. He looked so incredibly foolish, a fragile civilian playing dress-up in a world built on actual blood and sacrifice. I knew exactly who Sergeant First Class Mitchell was. I had read his personnel file during a cybersecurity clearance sweep 6 months ago. The man was a highly decorated combat veteran with 3 tours overseas. He did not care about legacy. He cared about merit, discipline, and absolute respect for the chain of command. Liam was about to step onto a landmine, and I was not going to do a single thing to stop him. Sergeant First Class Mitchell continued his rapid, unyielding march across the turf. He moved with the terrifying precision of a predator, zeroing in on a target. The crowds of celebrating families naturally parted before him, intimidated by the sheer authority radiating from his sharply pressed uniform and his iconic round brown campaign hat. His eyes were scanning the crowd, searching for something very specific, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. Liam stepped forward, planting his feet firmly in the grass, effectively blocking the drill sergeant's trajectory. He threw his right hand out in a broad, overly enthusiastic gesture of forced camaraderie. Sergeant Mitchell, Liam called out, his voice booming with the artificial authority of a wealthy legacy child. "Liam Vance. I am Second Lieutenant Jasmine Vance's husband. My father is retired Colonel Richard Vance, formerly of Army Material Command. I am sure you have heard of him. He still consults for the Pentagon. Liam stood there, his hand extended, waiting for the inevitable moment of deference. He expected the drill sergeant to snap to attention, and shake his hand with profound gratitude. He expected Mitchell to thank him for his father's service and immediately offer Jasmine whatever preferential treatment Liam demanded. Jerome and Yvonne were watching with bated breath, their faces glowing with the anticipation of witnessing Liam's immense power at work. Jasmine stood a little taller, ready to accept the unearned praise that she believed was her birthright. What happened next shattered their fragile reality in less than 3 seconds. Sergeant First Class Mitchell did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. He looked straight through Liam as if the arrogant white contractor were made of completely transparent glass. Mitchell did not acknowledge the outstretched hand, nor did he acknowledge the name of the retired colonel that Liam had so proudly weaponized. Instead, Mitchell kept walking his heavy boots, brushing right past Liam's expensive loafers. He moved with such intense momentum that Liam actually had to stumble backward to avoid being physically run over. Liam's arm was left awkwardly hanging in the empty air. The smug smile on his face instantly dissolved into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw dropped and he scrambled to regain his footing, completely bewildered by the absolute dismissal. "Hey!" Liam sputtered, his voice cracking with indignity. "Hey, Sergeant, I was talking to you." But Mitchell was not listening. He strode right past Jerome, who had instinctively taken a step back, thoroughly intimidated by the sergeant's massive physical presence. He ignored Yvonne, who had frozen with her hands still clasped together in midair. He marched right past Jasmine, the golden child, without giving her shiny new second lieutenant insignia a single glance. Sergeant First Class Mitchell walked directly toward the back of the group, his eyes locked entirely on me. I stood my ground, the heavy duffel bag still resting comfortably on my shoulder. The intense Georgia heat was radiating off the dark wool of my trench coat. My family turned around, completely baffled as to why this highly respected drill instructor was walking toward the disgrace of the family. Liam was red in the face, furious at being ignored, while Yvonne looked horrified, terrified that I was about to embarrass them in front of Jasmine's superior. "What are you doing?" Kendra Yvonne hissed under her breath, her voice laced with sudden panic and venom. "Move out of his way before you get us all in trouble. You are embarrassing your sister." I did not move a single inch. I kept my eyes fixed directly on Sergeant Mitchell as he closed the final few feet between us. As he approached, his eyes darted quickly down to the collar of my trench coat. Earlier, when I had reached down to lift Jasmine's duffel bag, the top button of my coat had shifted just enough to expose a tiny, unmistakable sliver of silver. It was a fraction of an inch of metal, but to a trained military professional, it was a blinding beacon. Mitchell stopped abruptly, planting his boots firmly in the dirt less than 2 feet away from me. The air around us seemed to instantly freeze despite the 90-degree heat. The loud, chaotic noise of the celebrating families faded into a dull background hum. Liam marched up behind the sergeant, opening his mouth to loudly demand respect for his father's name, but the words died in his throat. Because Sergeant First Class Mitchell was trembling. The hardened combat veteran, a man who broke arrogant recruits for a living, was standing perfectly still, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and profound realization. He was not looking at a dropout. He was not looking at a failure. He was looking at the exact woman whose classified directives dictated the movements of his entire command. He was looking at the apex predator of the military hierarchy. The silence stretching between us was heavy, electric, and entirely devastating to my family's fabricated reality. They watched paralyzed with utter confusion as the man they thought Liam could easily control stood frozen in front of the daughter they had spent a decade treating like absolute garbage. The trap had officially snapped shut, and they were all standing right in the center of it. Sergeant First Class Mitchell stood absolutely paralyzed. His eyes darted from my face to the tiny sliver of metal peeking over the collar of my heavy wool coat, and then back to my face. I watched the cognitive gears grinding in his head. He was a seasoned combat veteran, a man trained to assess threats and adapt to chaotic environments in milliseconds. But right now, his reality was completely short-circuiting. The air between us felt as thick as wet concrete. Liam was still standing just a few feet away from him, his mouth hanging half open, utterly bewildered as to why the man he was trying to command was staring at his supposedly worthless sister-in-law with pure, unadulterated terror. Suddenly, the color completely drained from Mitchell's dark skin, leaving him looking as if he had just witnessed a ghost materialize on the parade field. His ingrained survival instincts kicked in, overriding his profound shock. He straightened his spine with a violent jerk. His heavy combat boots snapped together with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed clearly over the ambient noise of the celebrating crowds. His right hand shot up in a flawless, rigid textbook salute. The edge of his hand aligned perfectly with the brim of his round brown campaign hat. He did not care that there were hundreds of civilians milling around. He did not care about Liam or his retired colonel father. He only cared about the flag officer standing quietly in the dirt directly in front of him. "Wait, you are a general!" Mitchell practically shouted the words, his voice deeply trained to project across massive physical training fields and cut through the deafening noise of live gunfire boomed with incredible volume. The words hung in the humid Georgia air like a detonated explosive. The families standing within a 20-foot radius instantly turned their heads, their joyous conversations dying out abruptly as they searched for the source of the commotion. But the silence that descended upon my own family was entirely absolute. It was a suffocating, crushing quiet. Yvonne stopped breathing entirely, her hands still frozen mid-air from when she was praising Liam just moments before. Jerome took a heavy, unsteady step backward, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the rigid drill sergeant, desperately searching for the punchline to a joke he could not comprehend. Jasmine stood completely still, the arrogant smirk wiped clean from her face, replaced by a vacant stare of total incomprehension. Liam was the most pathetic of them all. His brain completely rejected the auditory information it had just received. He looked at Mitchell, then looked at me, his eyes blinking rapidly as if trying to clear a hallucination. He opened his mouth to speak, to correct the sergeant, to demand that this ridiculous misunderstanding be cleared up immediately, but his vocal cords utterly refused to cooperate. I did not break eye contact with Sergeant First Class Mitchell. I did not smile, and I did not flinch. I reached up with my free hand, my movement slow, deliberate, and entirely in control. My fingers found the top button of my heavy black trench coat. I unfastened it, then the next, and the next. I worked my way down the thick wool fabric, ignoring the searing heat, ignoring the hundreds of eyes now locked directly on my every movement. I let the heavy canvas duffel bag slide off my shoulder, letting it hit the ground with a dull thud. Then I shrugged my shoulders backward, allowing the heavy trench coat to slide off my arms completely. It fell onto the dry grass behind me in a crumpled heap, an ugly cocoon finally discarded. The bright, punishing midday sun immediately hit the pristine, immaculate Army service uniform I wore beneath it. The dark blue fabric was perfectly tailored, the creases pressed sharp enough to cut glass. But it was the hardware that demanded absolute submission from everyone standing in my vicinity. On my left chest sat rows of colorful ribbons, quiet testaments to classified campaigns, massive intelligence operations, and silent victories that my family would never possess the necessary security clearance to even read about. On my collar rested the crossed lightning bolts of the United States Army Cyber Command, and there, gleaming fiercely in the intense sunlight on both of my shoulders, were the solid silver stars of a brigadier general. It was the ultimate symbol of absolute, undeniable authority. I stood there fully illuminated, no longer the disgraced dropout they had spent 10 long years mocking at every Thanksgiving dinner. I was the apex predator they never saw coming. I slowly raised my right hand, my fingers perfectly extended, and returned the drill sergeant's salute with the crisp, undeniable authority of a commanding officer. "Good afternoon, Sergeant Mitchell," I said. My voice was smooth, calm, and carried perfectly in the dead silence of the immediate area. "Stand at ease." Mitchell immediately dropped his salute, his arm snapping back to his side, and assumed the rigid parade rest position. His feet spread apart, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. His eyes were wide with a mixture of profound professional respect and genuine fear of having potentially offended a flag officer. Yes, he replied loudly. "It is an absolute honor to have you on the installation, General. I deeply apologize for the intrusion. I had no idea you were attending the commissioning ceremony today." I nodded slightly, allowing the barest hint of professional warmth to enter my tone. "You run a highly disciplined company, Sergeant. Your candidates looked incredibly sharp on the parade field today. You should be proud of the work you do here." "Thank you, General," he barked back, his chest swelling with genuine pride. That compliment completely dwarfed whatever fake validation Liam was trying to offer him moments ago. A commendation from a brigadier general was worth its weight in gold to a career non-commissioned officer. I finally shifted my gaze away from the soldier and turned to look at the four people standing just a few feet away. The silence radiating from my parents, my sister, and Liam was utterly deafening. It was not just quiet. It was the absolute absence of sound, the violent, spectacular death of a false reality they had built their entire lives around. Yvonne was staring at the silver star on my shoulder, as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at her chest. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to form words that simply did not exist in her vocabulary. The woman who had just called me a deranged homeless woman was currently looking at one of the highest-ranking military officials in the United States Armed Forces. Jerome looked visibly nauseous. The man who had spent his entire life worshipping status, visible wealth, and the opinions of his neighbors, was currently realizing he had spent the last decade treating a highly decorated military commander like an unwanted stray dog. His hands were shaking at his sides. Jasmine was completely pale. All the color had drained from her usually vibrant face. The shiny gold bar of her brand new second lieutenant, rank the very thing she thought made her vastly superior to me, suddenly looked like a cheap plastic toy standing next to the immense weight of my rank. She was looking at me not as an older sister she could bully, but as an entry-level officer looking up at the top of an insurmountable mountain. The chain of command was absolute, and she was at the very bottom while I sat comfortably at the top. And then there was Liam, the wealthy contractor, the arrogant white knight who thought he owned the world because of his father's retired status. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying realization that he had just spent the last hour throwing crumpled dollar bills and hurling insults at a woman who commanded the exact sector of the government that paid his company's invoices. The dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated, ground into fine dust beneath the polished heels of my military boots. The trap had sprung, the jaws had closed, and they had absolutely nowhere to run. The suffocating silence that had descended upon my family finally shattered. It did not break with an apology, a sudden dawn of respect, or even a quiet realization of their own massive mistakes. Instead, it was violently destroyed by the harsh, grating sound of Liam laughing. It was a frantic, nervous sound that completely lacked any genuine humor. His fragile ego, built entirely on unearned privilege, and his father's retired rank, violently rejected the reality standing right in front of him. His brain simply could not compute the data. To accept that I was a brigadier general meant accepting that he was nothing more than a failing civilian contractor standing in the shadow of a giant. And Liam would rather burn the entire parade field down than admit I was his superior. He took a heavy step forward, aggressively shaking his head as he pointed a trembling finger at my uniform. "All right, very funny," Kendra Liam announced, his voice artificially loud as he tried to project an authority he did not possess. "You actually had us going for a second there. That is a very elaborate prank. I have to admit, renting a perfectly tailored dress uniform just to come down here and ruin your sister's big day is a new level of desperate, even for you. Liam then turned his attention away from me and looked directly at Sergeant First Class Mitchell, who was still standing rigidly at the parade rest position. "You can stand down," Sergeant Liam ordered, waving his hand dismissively at the highly decorated combat veteran. "You do not need to salute her. She is not a flag officer. She is my wife's older sister. She is a 35-year-old college dropout who works a miserable data entry job in Washington, D.C. She probably bought that costume at a military surplus store on the highway just to get back at us for ignoring her all weekend." Sergeant Mitchell did not move a single muscle. His eyes remained locked straight ahead, completely ignoring Liam's frantic explanation. To a disciplined soldier, Liam was nothing more than ambient noise. Mitchell knew the difference between a surplus store costume and an authentic regulation issue, general officer's uniform. He recognized the heavy weight of the fabric, the precise alignment of the metals, and most importantly, he recognized my face from classified intelligence briefings. He knew exactly who I was, and the sheer terror radiating from his rigid posture made it incredibly clear that he thought Liam was about to get them both thrown into a federal military prison for treasonous disrespect. When Mitchell refused to break protocol, Liam's nervous laughter completely vanished, instantly replaced by a deep defensive rage. His face flushed a dark crimson. He took another step toward me, jabbing his finger in the air. "You are out of your mind if you think anyone is actually buying this nonsense," Liam shouted, completely losing his temper. "Nobody makes general at 35 years old. It is mathematically impossible. And even if it were possible, they certainly do not hand out stars to people like you. You do not have the pedigree. You do not have the family legacy. The only way someone your age gets that rank is through extreme nepotism or sleeping with the right politicians, and we all know you do not have the connections for either. You are a fraud, Kendra. A pathetic, jealous fraud." The moment Liam gave them an alternative narrative, no matter how entirely delusional it was, my parents and my sister grabbed onto it like drowning victims grabbing a life raft. The sheer idea that I was wearing a costume to ruin the day was much easier for them to swallow than the devastating truth of my success. Jasmine immediately realized that the spotlight had shifted entirely away from her. The bright gold bars of her new second lieutenant rank were completely overshadowed by the solid silver stars on my shoulders. She resorted to the only weapon she had ever successfully wielded in our family. She began to cry. It was not a quiet, dignified release of emotion. It was a loud, theatrical, deeply manipulative wail designed to immediately draw the attention and sympathy of every single person within a 50-foot radius. "She is psychotic," Jasmine screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my face while tears streamed down her cheeks. "She has always been completely psychotic. She spent months planning this just to humiliate me. Today was supposed to be about my commission. Today was supposed to be my absolute triumph, and she showed up in a fake uniform just to steal my moment. Look at her standing there like a sociopath. She hates me because I am actually successful, and she is a complete failure." Jasmine threw herself against Liam's chest, burying her face in his expensive polo shirt, sobbing hysterically. Liam wrapped his arms around her, glaring at me with absolute venom, playing the role of the protective husband, defending his innocent wife from a malicious predator. The surrounding crowd of families, initially shocked by the booming voice of the drill sergeant, were now openly staring at our family circus. They were whispering to each other, pointing at my pristine uniform, and then looking at the crying girl in the entry-level officer uniform. That was all it took for Yvonne to snap into action. My mother operated entirely on the currency of public perception. The thought of other affluent families witnessing a shameful scene involving her daughters was her ultimate nightmare. She stepped forward physically, placing herself between me and the crowd, completely ignoring the immense authority of the uniform I was wearing. In her eyes, I was not a military commander. I was just her disobedient, troublesome daughter who was currently ruining her perfect family portrait. "Take that ridiculous jacket off right now," Kendra Yvonne commanded. Her voice was sharp, cruel, and laced with the exact same venom she used when scolding me as a teenager. "I am not asking you, I am telling you. Strip that uniform off before you get yourself arrested and shame this entire family." Yvonne reached out as if she were actually going to physically grab the lapels of my coat. I did not move, but the sudden sharp shift in my eyes caused her to freeze halfway. She dropped her hand, but her tirade did not stop. "Do you have any idea what you are doing?" Yvonne hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the military police officers patrolling the far edge of the parade field. "Impersonating a military officer is a federal crime. You are going to go to federal prison. You are going to drag Jasmine's brand new career through the mud, and you are going to absolutely humiliate Liam's father. We brought you here out of the goodness of our hearts, out of sheer pity, and this is how you repay us. You are a sick, twisted girl. Take it off right now, and go wait in the car until we are done celebrating your sister." Jerome stepped up right beside her, nodding in fierce agreement. "If you do not take that costume off this second, I will personally drag you off this base." Jerome threatened, his voice trembling with misplaced rage. "You are no daughter of mine acting like this. You are a disgrace to the uniform and a disgrace to this family." I stood perfectly still in the warm Georgia sun. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not offer them a single shred of the angry reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply looked at them, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. My analytical mind was cataloging every single insult, every threat, and every ridiculous assumption they threw at my feet. They were digging their own graves with a backhoe, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was already collapsing. They genuinely believed their loud voices and harsh words could somehow alter reality. They thought if they yelled loud enough, the silver stars on my shoulders would simply melt away, and I would turn back into the pathetic failure they needed me to be. But reality does not bow to the tantrums of the weak. True power does not need to explain itself to ignorance. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their screaming accusations to hang in the air for everyone to hear. I let Jasmine sob. I let Liam puff out his chest. I let my mother and father threaten to disown me. I gave them every single inch of rope they asked for, completely confident in the knowledge that they were about to hang themselves on a spectacular, highly public stage. Liam was not satisfied with just yelling his delusional theories into the humid Georgia air. His bruised ego required a public execution to restore the natural order of things in his mind. He looked around the chaotic parade field, his eyes frantically searching for an external authority to validate his completely shattered worldview. He could not accept that the drill sergeant was right, which meant he had to find someone with even more authority to prove me wrong. He spotted exactly what he was looking for. Two military police officers were patrolling the perimeter of the grassy field about 50 yards away. Their bright white lanyards and heavy-duty belts stood out sharply against their camouflage uniforms. They were scanning the crowds, ensuring the massive civilian presence remained orderly after the commissioning ceremony. Liam's face lit up with a dangerous, triumphant gleam. The sheer panic that had gripped him moments before was instantly replaced by a manic, desperate arrogance. He turned back to my parents, puffing out his chest and assuming the role of the seasoned, highly knowledgeable military spouse. "I will handle this right now," Liam announced, his voice oozing with a sickening level of false heroism. "Stolen valor is a severe federal offense, especially on an active military installation. These officers are going to drag her out of here in handcuffs, and I am going to make sure my father presses the maximum charges for embarrassing this family." Before Yvonne or Jerome could even nod in agreement, Liam spun around and raised his arm high into the air, waving frantically at the two patrolling officers. "Officers over here!" Liam bellowed, his voice cracking slightly with manic excitement. "We need assistance immediately. We have a civilian committing a federal crime right here." The two military police officers immediately changed their trajectory. They were highly trained to respond to disturbances quickly and efficiently, especially during high-profile events populated by hundreds of overexcited civilians. They jogged over their heavy boots thudding against the dry earth in perfect unison. Their hands rested instinctively near the heavy equipment on their duty belts, and the crackle of their shoulder-mounted radios cut through the ambient noise of the crowd. They were assessing the situation as they approached, their eyes sweeping over the crying second lieutenant, the panicked older couple, and the loud, frantic white man waving them down. They likely expected to find a drunk family member or an aggressive protester causing a scene. They certainly did not expect to find me. Liam eagerly stepped forward to intercept them before they could even get within 10 feet of where I was standing. He physically blocked their line of sight, to me taking complete control of the narrative in his desperate bid to remain the most important man in the area. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly." Liam began, dropping his voice into a serious, artificially deep register that he clearly thought sounded professional. "My name is Liam Vance. My father is retired Colonel Richard Vance, formerly of Army Material Command. We are here celebrating my wife's commissioning today, but we have a severe security issue." The two MPs slowed their pace, their expressions hardened into masks of professional neutrality. They did not look particularly impressed by the name drop, but they listened intently to the complaint. Liam pointed an accusing finger back over his shoulder in my general direction. "My sister-in-law is mentally unstable and has arrived on base wearing a fraudulent general officer's uniform." Liam declared, his voice rising in pitch as he grew more confident in his own lie. "She is actively impersonating a flag officer to disrupt a military ceremony and harass my wife. I need you to place her under arrest for stolen valor and remove her from the premises immediately before she causes a larger scene and disrespects the actual soldiers here." Yvonne stepped up right behind Liam, nodding vigorously, entirely willing to throw her own daughter to federal law enforcement to save face. "She is deeply unwell, officers," Yvonne added, playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering mother to absolute perfection. "She bought that ridiculous costume just to ruin her sister's big day because she is violently jealous. Please just take her away quietly so we can salvage our family celebration." Jasmine continued to sob softly into a tissue, keeping her head down, entirely committing to her performance as the helpless victim. The lead military police officer, a tall, heavily built sergeant with a stern face and piercing dark eyes, held up a gloved hand to stop Liam's frantic rambling. "Sir, step aside and let us assess the situation," the sergeant commanded. His voice was firm, entirely unimpressed by Liam, and carried the heavy weight of a man who did not have time for civilian theatrics. Liam smirked, looking back at my parents with a triumphant nod, fully believing he had just successfully ordered a military strike on his own sister-in-law. He confidently stepped to the side, sweeping his arm out in a theatrical, mocking gesture to present me to the officers. The two MPs stepped forward, their hands still resting cautiously on their duty belts, preparing to confront a delusional civilian impersonating a high-ranking official. They closed the distance, stepping into the clear, bright sunlight where I was standing perfectly still. The lead sergeant locked eyes with me. His gaze dropped immediately to the collar of my immaculately pressed blue uniform, taking in the crossed lightning bolts of the Cyber Command insignia. Then his eyes moved to my shoulders. The solid silver stars gleamed blindingly in the midday sun. The physical reaction of the two military police officers was instantaneous, violent, and entirely involuntary. The heavy, authoritative swagger they had carried while approaching completely vanished in a fraction of a second. They hit an invisible brick wall of absolute military hierarchy. Both men stopped so abruptly that the gravel and dry dirt crunched sharply beneath their boots, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Their hands flew away from their duty belts as if the heavy black leather had suddenly caught fire. They snapped their boots together with a violent, synchronized crack that sounded like a gunshot on the open field. Their spines straightened into rigid planks of absolute submission, their chests puffed out, and both of their right hands shot up into flawless textbook salutes. The muscle memory drilled into them over years of service took complete control. There was no hesitation. There was no questioning the validity of the uniform. They saw the face, they saw the rank, and they instantly submitted to the absolute top of the chain of command. The lead sergeant, barked, his voice entirely stripped of the stern authority he had just used on Liam. "Good afternoon, General." The second officer echoed the greeting loudly, his eyes locked straight ahead, completely terrified. The realization that they had almost approached a brigadier general as a criminal suspect, based on the word of a frantic, lying civilian, was radiating off them in waves of pure anxiety. I slowly raised my right hand and returned their salutes with crisp, practiced precision. "Good afternoon, officers," I replied calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. At ease. Both MPs immediately dropped their salutes and assumed the parade rest position. Their feet spread apart, their hands clasped firmly behind their backs, waiting in absolute silence for my direct orders. They did not look at Liam. They did not look at Yvonne or Jasmine. They existed only to serve my command. The triumphant smirk on Liam's face evaporated so quickly, it looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. His brain completely short-circuited. He stared at the two massive, heavily armed military police officers standing in absolute subservience to the woman he had just demanded they arrest. The reality of the situation crashed down on him with the devastating force of a collapsing building. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords utterly failed to produce a coherent sound. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. But Liam finally choked out his voice, a weak, high-pitched wheeze that barely carried over the ambient noise of the crowd. "But she is wearing a costume. I told you she is a fraud. Why are you saluting her? Grab her. Put her in handcuffs. My father is a colonel." The lead MP slowly turned his head to look at Liam. The look of sheer disgust and terrifying warning on the officer's face was enough to make Liam physically flinch backward. The MP did not say a single word to the civilian. He did not need to. The lethal glare communicated entirely that if Liam spoke another disrespectful word to a flag officer, he would be the one leaving the installation in handcuffs. The officer simply looked back at me, his posture rigid, waiting for my command on how to handle the deeply offensive man who had just committed a massive infraction by trying to falsely report a general. Yvonne and Jerome stood completely frozen in the grass behind Liam. The color rapidly drained from their faces, leaving them looking ashen and hollow as the horrific reality finally undeniably set in. The law enforcement they had eagerly summoned to destroy me, to drag me away in humiliation, was now standing at my absolute disposal. Jasmine stopped fake crying entirely. The tissue dropped from her trembling hand, fluttering uselessly to the dirt. They were completely surrounded by my authority, trapped in a world where my word was absolute law, and their lies meant absolutely nothing. The absolute silence that had trapped my family in a suffocating bubble was suddenly broken by a shift in the crowd's energy. The sea of celebrating families, junior officers, and enlisted personnel naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path. Walking down the center of that path was a man who commanded the immediate respect of every single person on the installation. It was the base commander, a 2-star major general, whose chest was heavily decorated with decades of combat and leadership ribbons. He was a tall, imposing white man with silver hair and the kind of sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. As he approached our location, Sergeant First Class Mitchell and the 2 military police officers instantly snapped to rigid attention, saluting the highest-ranking officer on the field. Major General on deck, the lead MP, barked, his voice carrying the utmost reverence. My parents, completely out of their depth and terrified by the sudden influx of heavy military authority, instinctively shrank back. Liam swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He tried to straighten his posture, perhaps desperately hoping that the base commander was walking over to personally thank him for identifying a fraud. He opened his mouth, preparing to launch into his rehearsed speech about his retired colonel father, but the major general did not even glance in his direction. The base commander walked straight up to me, a massive, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. He completely bypassed the formalities of a rigid salute. Instead, he reached out and pulled me into a warm, firm embrace, clapping me solidly on the shoulder. Kendra. I thought I recognized you from the VIP box. The Major General boomed his voice, radiating immense respect and camaraderie. It is an absolute honor to have you on my installation. When they told me someone from United States Cyber Command was attending, I never imagined it would be the commanding general herself. I smiled, a genuine expression of professional warmth that I had never once directed at my family. It is good to see you again, General Sterling, I replied smoothly. I appreciate the hospitality. Your candidates put on a flawless parade today. Sterling laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. Well, I am just shocked you managed to get away from Washington. With the intelligence briefings you run and the national security grid you are constantly monitoring, I figured you were chained to your desk in the Pentagon SCIF. Taking time out of highly classified operations just to attend a basic entry-level commissioning ceremony is a testament to your character, Kendra. The words hung in the hot Georgia air, heavy and undeniable. A basic entry-level commissioning ceremony. In one sentence, the two-star general had publicly validated my exact rank, praised my critical importance to national security, and completely minimized the very event my family had spent the entire weekend treating like the most important milestone in human history. I did not have to look at Jasmine to know that her fragile ego had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The shiny gold bars of a second lieutenant meant absolutely nothing in this circle. She was standing in the presence of two flag officers, casually discussing Pentagon intelligence briefings. For the first time in her pampered golden child life, Jasmine was completely and utterly irrelevant. Yvonne looked like she was going to faint. Her hands were clutching her expensive leather purse so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Jerome was staring at the ground, utterly defeated, the realization of his monumental stupidity finally crushing the life out of his arrogance. But General Sterling was not finished. His sharp eyes caught the tense posture of the two military police officers standing at parade rest, and then shifted to Liam, who was sweating profusely and hyperventilating in the midday sun. The warm, jovial demeanor of the base commander vanished in an instant. The temperature in his eyes dropped to absolute zero. He stepped back from me, assuming the terrifying, unyielding posture of a military leader confronting a disruption on his base. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Sterling demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "Why are you away from your patrol sector, and why is this civilian sweating like he just ran a marathon in a winter coat?" The lead MP maintained his rigid stance, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Sir, we were flagged down by this civilian," the MP reported loudly and clearly. "He requested emergency assistance." Sterling narrowed his eyes, turning his piercing gaze directly onto Liam. Liam physically recoiled, taking a trembling step backward. The unearned confidence he had paraded around all day was completely eradicated. He was a civilian playing a dangerous game, and he had just drawn the attention of the apex predator. "You requested emergency assistance?" Sterling asked, his tone dripping with lethal skepticism. "On my parade field, during my commissioning ceremony. Speak up, son. What is the catastrophic emergency that required you to pull my officers away from their duties?" Liam opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, high-pitched squeak came out. He looked at my mother for help, but Yvonne immediately looked away, completely abandoning him to save herself. He looked at Jasmine, but she was staring blankly at the grass, entirely consumed by her own humiliation. Liam was entirely alone. I decided to step in. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display a single ounce of anger. I smiled coldly, my voice dripping with the kind of polite, devastating diplomacy that cuts deeper than any screaming match ever could. "There is no emergency, General Sterling," I stated calmly, folding my hands behind my back. My brother-in-law, Liam Vance, was just expressing his passionate, though deeply misinformed respect for the uniform. He lacks the security clearance to know what I do for a living, so when I unbuttoned my coat, He assumed I had purchased these stars at a surplus store. He was simply trying to have me arrested for stolen valor. He even tried to use his father's retired rank to order your drill sergeant and your police officers to place me in handcuffs. The silence that followed my explanation was so profound, you could have heard a pin drop on the grass. The two MPs stiffened even further, terrified of the base commander's impending wrath. Sterling slowly turned his entire body to fully face Liam. The sheer disgust radiating from the two-star general was a physical force. You tried to order my men to arrest a brigadier general of the United States Army. Sterling asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I thought she was lying. Liam stammered, tears of sheer panic welling up in his eyes. My dad is Richard Vance. Colonel Richard Vance. He used to work in Material Command. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the ceremony. Do not you dare invoke your father's name to excuse your profound stupidity, Sterling roared, the sudden explosion of volume making my entire family flinch violently. I know Richard Vance, and I guarantee you Richard would be deeply ashamed to see his son acting like an entitled, disrespectful clown on a military installation. You do not possess rank. You do not possess authority. You are a civilian guest on my base, and you have just deeply insulted a highly decorated flag officer who does more to protect this country before breakfast than you will achieve in your entire pathetic lifetime. Liam withered under the verbal assault. He hunched his shoulders, looking completely broken and thoroughly humiliated in front of the hundreds of people who were now openly watching the spectacle. If it were up to me, Sterling continued, stepping so close to Liam that the contractor had to lean backward, I would have these officers escort you off my installation immediately and permanently ban you from ever stepping foot on federal property again. However, since General Kendra is far more gracious than I am, I will leave your fate to her. Sterling turned back to me, his demeanor instantly returning to one of profound professional respect. General, do you want this man removed from the premises? I looked at Liam. His face was pale, his eyes wide and pleading. He looked at me with genuine terror, realizing that with one single nod of my head, I could have him physically thrown out of his own wife's graduation. I looked at Yvonne, who was silently begging me with her eyes not to cause a public scandal. I looked at Jerome, who looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. I let them sweat in the blistering heat for a long, agonizing moment. I savored the absolute power of holding their social standing, their pride, and their immediate future entirely in the palm of my hand. That will not be necessary, General Sterling, I finally replied, my voice smooth and indifferent. I believe Mr. Vance has thoroughly learned his lesson about assuming authority he does not possess. We have a family dinner to attend, and I would hate to ruin my sister's special day with an arrest. Sterling nodded, a knowing glint in his sharp eyes. He understood exactly what I was doing. Letting them live with the humiliation was a far worse punishment than simply kicking them out. You are a better officer than I am, Kendra, he said softly. He turned his attention to the 2 military police officers. Return to your patrol routes. And if this civilian causes any more disruptions, you have my direct authorization to detain him. Yes, sir, the MPs shouted in unison. They delivered one final crisp salute to both of us, turned on their heels and jogged away across the field. Sergeant Mitchell, sensing the confrontation was over, snapped another flawless salute, which I returned before he marched off to rejoin his company. General Sterling gave my shoulder one last squeeze. I will let you get back to your family, General. Have a safe flight back to the Pentagon. Your country needs you on that wall. With that, the base commander turned and strode away, parting the crowd with his immense presence. I was left standing in the bright Georgia sun, surrounded by my absolutely ruined family. The dark trench coat lay discarded on the grass behind me. The silver stars on my shoulders caught the sunlight blindingly bright. I looked at Liam, then at my parents, and finally at Jasmine. I believe we have a reservation at an expensive steakhouse, I said calmly, stepping perfectly over the olive drab duffel bag Jasmine had ordered me to carry. Lead the way. The drive from the sweltering parade field at Fort Moore to the high-end steakhouse in downtown Columbus took exactly 45 minutes. I drove my own vehicle, enjoying the absolute silence of my sedan, but I knew the frantic text messages flying back and forth between my parents and Liam in his luxury SUV must have been extraordinary. They had 45 minutes to process the devastating reality that the daughter they had treated like a stray dog for a decade was actually one of the most powerful women in the United States military. By the time we walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant, the family dynamic had undergone a violent, sickening metamorphosis. I was no longer the shameful family secret to be hidden behind Liam's shoulders. Suddenly, I was the absolute center of their entire universe. The restaurant was dark, heavily air-conditioned, and smelled of aged beef, rich leather, and expensive truffles. The hostess led us to a private dining room in the back, a luxurious space Liam had booked months ago to celebrate his wife's commissioning. But as we approached the large, polished mahogany table, the seating arrangements instantly reflected the new hierarchy. Jerome practically shoved Jasmine out of the way to reach the head of the table. He pulled out the largest, most prominent chair and gestured toward it with a grand, sweeping motion. "Sit right here at the head of the table," General Jerome announced. His voice was practically dripping with a repulsive, newly discovered reverence that made my skin crawl. He wiped a microscopic speck of dust off the back of the chair, eager to play the role of the proud, supportive father. I sat down silently, adjusting the lapels of my dark blue uniform jacket. Jasmine, the supposed guest of honor who had just officially become a second lieutenant, was left to awkwardly pull out her own chair on the far side of the table. Her face was pinched in bitter resentment, her eyes darting between me and our father. Just 2 hours ago, she had commanded me to carry her heavy luggage and mocked my salary. Now she was completely invisible in her own celebration. The waiter entered the room and handed out the thick, leather-bound menus. Earlier that afternoon, Jasmine had loudly suggested I order a side salad because it was all my pathetic data entry salary could afford. Now Jerome tossed his menu onto the table with a theatrical sigh and immediately reached for the leather-bound reserve wine list. He flipped through the pages with aggressive entitlement, his eyes scanning only the right side of the page where the highest prices were listed. "We are celebrating a truly historic day for this family," Jerome boomed, looking directly at the waiter but making sure his voice carried to every corner of our private room. "I want to start with a bottle of your absolute finest Cabernet. Actually make it 2 bottles of the 2012 Reserve. And bring out your largest seafood tower for the table. We will be putting this all on one check." Jerome looked across the table at me, flashing a wide, predatory smile that revealed the sheer depth of his greed. "I am sure our newly discovered Brigadier General wants to treat her family to a proper celebration. After all, with that kind of Pentagon salary and all those classified government perks, a few $1,000s on dinner is just pocket change, right, Kendra? It is the least you can do to thank us for bringing you down here today." I did not reach for my purse. I did not nod in agreement. I simply picked up my crystal water goblet and took a slow, measured sip. The sheer audacity of his greed was mathematically fascinating. The man who had physically shoved me out of a family photograph because my trench coat embarrassed him was now trying to use my classified government rank as a limitless credit card to fund his luxurious appetite. Seeing that I was not going to openly argue about the bill, Yvonne took her cue perfectly. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the crisp, white tablecloth, her eyes shining with a deeply unsettling, entirely fabricated warmth. She reached across the table, attempting to place her hand over mine, but I smoothly pulled my hand back and rested it in my lap. She did not miss a beat. "I always knew it," Yvonne declared, placing a hand dramatically over her heart and looking at me as if I were the second coming of Christ. "I told your father years ago, I said our Kendra is meant for absolute greatness. I knew the moment you dropped out of that law program that you had a secret, brilliant plan. I knew you were meant for something vastly superior to a boring corporate law firm." The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically cut it with my steak knife. This was the exact same woman who just a few hours earlier had stood on a parade field and loudly told a crowd of strangers that I had ruined my life and brought immense shame to the family name. Now she was completely rewriting history to cast herself as the visionary architect of my success. You know, Yvonne continued, looking around the table at Jerome and Liam, to ensure everyone was absorbing her profound maternal wisdom. It was my strict parenting that built her resilience. If I had coddled her the way other mothers do, she never would have developed the thick skin required to climb the military ranks. All those times I pushed you away, Kendra, all those times I was hard on you and demanded absolute perfection, it was just tough love. I was forging you into a weapon. You really have me to thank for that star on your shoulder. You are a general today because I refused to let you be weak. I set my water glass down on the table. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, deeply analyzing the absolute delusion dancing in her pupils. She actually believed her own lies. She had to believe them. The psychological alternative was admitting that she had spent 35 years actively trying to destroy the most successful, powerful person in her bloodline. It was easier to rewrite the narrative of her abuse into a masterclass of parenting than to face the reality of her own toxic failures. Jasmine sat silently, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her cloth napkin beneath the table. The golden child was entirely forgotten. The celebration of her hard-earned commissioning had been completely hijacked by the immense gravity of my rank. Liam was staring at his empty bread plate, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The base commander's brutal public reprimand was clearly still echoing in his head, temporarily stripping him of all his false bravado. But his silence did not mean he was humbled or apologetic. It just meant his chaotic brain was rapidly calculating his next angle of attack. The waiter returned a few minutes later with the 2 bottles of incredibly expensive reserve wine. He presented the cork to Jerome, who waved it away dismissively with the wave of a king holding court. "Pour the first glass for the general." Jerome ordered, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. The waiter stepped beside my chair, preparing to pour the dark red liquid into my polished wine glass. I lifted my right hand and placed it firmly over the rim of the glass. "I do not drink alcohol," I stated calmly, keeping my gaze fixed on my father. "I have a highly classified security briefing at 0400 hours tomorrow morning. I will stick with ice water." Jerome's wide smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine annoyance crossing his face, but he quickly recovered. He was completely desperate to maintain the fragile illusion of our happy, prosperous family dynamic in front of the restaurant staff. "Suit yourself." Jerome laughed nervously, gesturing for the waiter to pour his glass instead. "More for the rest of us. We have a lot of lost time to make up for, Kendra. We need to talk about how your new position is going to elevate this entire family to the next level." I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. I watched them gorge themselves on the expensive appetizers the waiter brought out. Their eyes darted to the silver stars on my uniform every few seconds, like starving vultures eyeing a fresh carcass. They had completely pivoted from absolute disgust to predatory greed in the span of a single afternoon. They thought my success was their success. They genuinely believed that because we shared the same genetic makeup, they were automatically entitled to the power, the access, and the wealth that I had built with my own 2 hands in the absolute dark. I remained entirely silent, watching the hypocrisy unfold in real time. I let them build their fragile castles in the sky. I let them drink the $500 wine they assumed I was paying for. I knew exactly how fast the ground was going to drop out from underneath them, and I was going to let them climb as high as possible before I kicked the ladder away. The waiter cleared the remaining silver platters from the center of the table, leaving behind only crumbs and empty oyster shells. Jasmine finally broke her sullen silence. The golden child could only handle being ignored for so long before she had to assert herself back into the narrative. She pushed her half-eaten salad away and folded her arms across the chest of her freshly pressed uniform. "Listen, Kendra." Jasmine began, her voice lacking any of the respect required when addressing a superior officer. Now that we know you actually have some pull in Washington, I need you to make a few phone calls for me tomorrow morning. My commissioning officer handed me my tentative orders right before the ceremony, and they are completely unacceptable. I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my neutral expression. And what are these unacceptable orders, Lieutenant? Jasmine rolled her eyes, completely missing the deliberate use of her new, vastly inferior rank. They want to send me to Fort Stewart, she complained, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. They are assigning me to a mechanized infantry brigade. Do you know what that means? It means I am going to be stuck in the miserable Georgia swamps, sleeping in tents, dealing with mud and heavy equipment for the next 3 years. I am not doing that. I did not go through all that training just to ruin my skin in the field. I belong in an air-conditioned office. I want a billet at the Pentagon. Yvonne immediately nodded in agreement, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a cloth napkin. Your sister is entirely right, Kendra. She chimed in, perfectly resuming her role as the overbearing manager of Jasmine's life. Jasmine is far too delicate and refined for field work. She belongs in high society, networking with the top brass. You are a general. You work in the Pentagon. Just have her transferred to your division. You can make her your personal aide or something. It is a simple administrative fix. The sheer audacity of the request was breathtaking. They genuinely believed that the United States military operated like a corrupt family business. Jasmine had not even served a single day of active duty, yet she was already demanding to bypass the grueling foundational work that every successful officer must endure. She wanted the prestige of the uniform without a single ounce of the sacrifice. Before I could address Jasmine's ridiculous demand, Liam suddenly leaned forward. The brutal reprimand from General Sterling had faded just enough for his inherited greed to overpower his temporary humiliation. He rested his forearms on the mahogany table, adopting the conspiratorial, overly familiar posture of a businessman about to pitch a lucrative scam. Actually, while we are talking about administrative favors, Liam interjected, his voice dropping into a sleazy, calculated tone. We need to talk about Vance Solutions, my cybersecurity firm. I slowly turned my attention to Liam. I let my silence prompt him to continue, eager to hear exactly how he planned to dig his own grave. Look, Kendra, Liam said, flashing a tight, nervous smile that did not reach his eyes. The defense contracting market is incredibly saturated right now. My father's old connections at Material Command have mostly dried up since he retired. The procurement officers are ignoring my emails, and frankly, the company is bleeding capital. But you are the commanding general of Cyber Command. You control billions of dollars in defense spending. You literally write the checks for software infrastructure. Jerome leaned in closer, his eyes practically glowing with dollar signs. That is exactly right, Jerome cheered, slapping the table with his open palm. We keep the money in the family. This is how legacy families build generational wealth. Liam nodded eagerly, encouraged by my father's ignorant support. I do not need a handout, Liam lied smoothly. I just need you to fast-track my software through the vendor approval process. Bypass the standard bidding wars. Introduce me directly to your top procurement officers, and mandate that they authorize Vance Solutions for the next major Pentagon server upgrade. It is a win for everyone. You look like a genius for bringing in a trusted family contractor, and I secure a $50 million government contract to save my company. I looked at the four of them sitting around the table. They were staring at me with breathless anticipation. They had successfully mapped out an entire criminal conspiracy over a single course of appetizers. Jasmine wanted to commit flagrant nepotism to avoid serving her country. Liam wanted to bypass federal law to secure a fraudulent government contract. And my parents were enthusiastically cheering them on, entirely convinced that my decade of highly classified, flawless military service was nothing more than a tool for them to exploit. I picked up my water goblet and took another slow sip. I let the silence stretch until Liam began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. You want a direct contract with United States Cyber Command? I said, my voice dangerously soft. Exactly. Liam agreed enthusiastically, adjusting his expensive collar. We are perfectly positioned to handle your infrastructure needs. That is fascinating, I replied, placing the glass back on the table. Because if you are going to bypass the federal bidding process and secure a $50 million contract directly from my desk, I need to ensure your product is flawless. So, Liam, tell me about your encryption protocols. How exactly is Vance Solutions currently mitigating the vulnerabilities inherent in quantum decryption algorithms targeting legacy RSA frameworks? Liam froze. The eager, greedy smile completely evaporated from his face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He blinked rapidly, staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a dead language. I did not let him off the hook. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, mirroring his exact posture from a moment ago. Come on, Liam. I pressed, my tone shifting into the cold, clinical voice of a military interrogator. You want Pentagon money. You must know your own software. Are you utilizing a zero-trust architecture across your cloud-based nodes, or are you still relying on outdated perimeter defense models? Furthermore, what is your automated response latency when dealing with a distributed denial of service attack originating from a multi-vector state-sponsored botnet? Liam began to sweat. Small beads of perspiration formed on his forehead. He looked frantically at Jerome, then at Jasmine, but neither of them could help him. They were completely lost, staring blankly at the technical terminology dominating the room. Well, Liam stammered, his voice cracking slightly. We use industry standard security. We have very strong firewalls. Our firewalls are top of the line. Firewalls, I repeated, allowing a sharp, condescending laugh to escape my lips. You want a $50 million military contract to protect the United States electrical grid, and your primary defense mechanism is a firewall. That is like trying to stop a ballistic missile with a screen door. I know what I'm talking about, Liam said defensively, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. We use heavy encryption. The best encryption. End to end. It is completely unhackable. There is no such thing as unhackable software, Liam, I countered instantly, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. Anyone who uses that word in my office gets laughed out of the Pentagon. Your technical knowledge is a complete joke. You do not even know the basic architecture of the product you are trying to sell to the federal government. You are just repeating meaningless buzzwords you read in an airline magazine. Liam shrank back into his chair, utterly dismantled. The illusion of his brilliance was completely shattered in front of the very family he had spent years trying to impress. He was not a tech genius. He was a fraud coasting on his father's name, and I had just exposed his profound incompetence in less than 60 seconds. The trap had closed perfectly, but I was not finished. I had barely even begun to address the audacity of their demands. I turned my gaze away from Liam's sweating, humiliated face and looked directly at Jasmine. She was still sitting with her arms crossed, her lower lip pushed out in a childish pout, waiting for me to validate her ridiculous fantasy of skipping the hard work. She genuinely believed that because we shared a last name, she was exempt from the grueling reality of the oath she had just sworn. Jasmine, I said, my voice completely devoid of the sisterly warmth she was trying to exploit. Let me make this incredibly clear. You are not going to the Pentagon. You are going to Fort Stewart. You are going to pack your bags, report to your mechanized infantry brigade, and you are going to learn how to be a real soldier. Jasmine gasped, her posture rigid with immediate offense. Yvonne slammed her hand flat against the table. You cannot be serious, Kendra. My mother snapped, her voice rising in pitch. You have the power to fix this with one phone call. Why are you being so vindictive to your own sister? It is not vindictive, Mother, I replied smoothly. It is the fundamental core of the United States Army. A second lieutenant earns their placement through merit, sweat, and absolute dedication to the troops they command. They do not earn it through nepotism. If I pull strings to place an untested, entitled, completely inexperienced junior officer into one of the most highly classified buildings on the planet, I would be compromising the integrity of my entire command. Jasmine needs to learn how to lead in the mud before she ever steps foot in an air-conditioned war room. If she cannot handle Fort Stewart, she should resign her commission tomorrow morning. Jasmine stared at me, her mouth hanging open. The sheer finality in my voice left absolutely zero room for negotiation. She looked at our mother for backup, but Yvonne was temporarily speechless, completely unable to argue against the crushing logic of military doctrine I had just dropped on them. I then shifted my attention back to Liam. He had spent the last 3 minutes trying to shrink into the expensive leather upholstery of his chair, but I was not going to let him escape the spotlight. "You asked for a $50 million contract, Liam." I continued, my tone shifting back to the icy professionalism of a Pentagon audit. "You wanted me to bypass federal procurement laws to bail out your failing company. Let me tell you exactly why that is never going to happen." Liam swallowed hard, refusing to meet my eyes. He stared intensely at his half-empty water glass, as if it held the secrets to the universe. "Your cybersecurity protocols are an absolute joke," I stated cleanly, the words cutting through the heavy air of the private dining room like a scalpel. "My division has been monitoring the defense contracting sector very closely. We know exactly why your father's old contacts are ignoring your emails. Your company has failed 3 consecutive shadow audits. You are running outdated legacy systems, your encryption architecture is deeply flawed, and you do not employ a single engineer capable of handling a modern threat landscape. You are selling a cheap illusion of security." Liam's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "You have no right to talk about my business like that," he muttered weakly, his fake bravado completely shattered. "We are a respected vendor. You are a liability," I corrected him instantly. "And I am the commanding officer responsible for ensuring that the United States military network remains impenetrable. I would never, under any circumstances, authorize your absolute garbage software to protect American assets. If I let your company anywhere near our servers, I would be practically handing the keys of our national security directly to our adversaries. You are not going to get a Pentagon contract, Liam. You are going to watch your company go bankrupt because you refuse to do the actual work required to build a viable product." The silence that followed was absolute. The brutal, unfiltered truth hung over the mahogany table, completely suffocating their delusions of grandeur. I had systematically dismantled their entire strategy. There would be no nepotism for the golden child. There would be no fraudulent bailout for the arrogant son-in-law. There would be absolutely no free ride on the back of the woman they had spent a decade treating like a pathetic failure. Suddenly, the fragile quiet was violently shattered. Jerome slammed his heavy fist down on the table with such immense force that the expensive crystal wine glasses rattled dangerously against the plates. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The mask of the proud, supportive father had been completely ripped away, revealing the bitter, resentful man beneath. "You selfish, ungrateful traitor," Jerome roared, the veins bulging prominently on his forehead. "We are your family. We are your blood. We brought you into this world, and the second you get a little bit of power, you turn your back on us. You sit there in your fancy uniform looking down your nose at us, acting like you are better than the people who raised you." I watched him throw his tantrum with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. He was lashing out because he had entirely lost control. The narrative he had carefully constructed, the one where he was the patriarch of a highly successful legacy family, was currently burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. "You could change our lives tonight," Jerome continued to scream, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You could secure your sister's future. You could save Liam's business. You could make sure your mother and I are taken care of for the rest of our lives. But you will not do it because you are a spiteful, jealous little girl. You always have been. You have all this money and all this power, and you refuse to help your own flesh and blood. You are a disgrace to this family, Kendra." I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not offer a tearful defense or an angry rebuttal. I simply looked at the man who had shoved me out of a family photograph just 2 hours prior. I looked at the mother who had demanded I strip off my uniform in public. I looked at the sister who had ordered me to carry her luggage. And I looked at the brother-in-law who had thrown a crumpled $20 bill at my chest. They did not want a daughter. They did not want a sister. They wanted a limitless bank account they could drain to fund their own profound mediocrity. "I am not a disgrace to this family, Jerome," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, but carrying an authority that instantly silenced his screaming. "I am the only actual success story this family has ever produced, and I built it entirely in the dark without a single ounce of your support, your love, or your money. I owe you absolutely nothing." I calmly pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. The heavy fabric of my blue uniform shifted perfectly into place. I smoothed the lapels, feeling the solid weight of the silver stars on my shoulders. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a slim black leather wallet. The timing could not have been more perfect. At that exact moment, the private dining room door swung open and two waiters entered carrying massive, towering silver platters loaded with the most expensive seafood the restaurant offered. Lobster tails, massive king crab legs, and dozens of fresh oysters were piled high over crushed ice. Another waiter followed closely behind, carrying the 2 bottles of $500 reserve wine Jerome had enthusiastically ordered just 20 minutes ago. They placed the extravagant feast on the center of the table. Jerome stared at the massive spread of food, his anger suddenly replaced by a creeping cold sense of panic. He had ordered all of this operating under the absolute assumption that my supposedly bottomless government salary was going to cover the bill. I opened my wallet and pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. I tossed it onto the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of my empty water glass. "That covers my steak and my glass of ice water, plus a generous tip for the waitstaff," I announced, my voice echoing coldly in the luxurious room. Yvonne looked at the single $100 bill, then looked up at me, her eyes widening in sheer terror. "Kendra, wait!" she stammered, her arrogant facade completely crumbling. "You cannot just leave. We ordered all this food to celebrate. Your father put this all on one check." I looked down at her, offering a perfectly polite, entirely ruthless smile. "You are absolutely right, Mother. You ordered it, which means you are going to pay for it. I highly suggest you enjoy the lobster. I hear it pairs wonderfully with bankruptcy." Jerome looked at the mountain of seafood and the 2 bottles of reserve wine. The total bill sitting on that table was easily pushing $3,000. I knew for an absolute fact that Jerome's postal pension and Yvonne's part-time administrative salary could not cover a fraction of that cost. Liam was broke, and Jasmine was an entry-level officer with zero savings. They were completely trapped. "You cannot do this to us." Liam choked out his face, pale with absolute dread, as he mentally calculated the financial ruin sitting on the table in front of him. "We cannot afford this." "Then you should not have ordered it," I replied simply. I turned my back on them. I did not look over my shoulder as I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I ignored Yvonne's sudden desperate pleading. I ignored Jerome's frantic demands for me to come back and settle the tab. I walked out of the private dining room, the heavy door clicking shut firmly behind me, cutting off their panicked voices entirely. I walked through the dimly lit restaurant, stepped out into the warm, humid Georgia evening, and walked toward my car. I left them sitting at a table surrounded by an expensive feast they could not afford, forced to finally choke down the bitter reality of the consequences they had created for themselves. 2 weeks passed in absolute silence. Following the catastrophic dinner where I left my family to swallow a $3,000 bill, my phone did not ring a single time. There were no demands for an apology, no guilt trips from my mother, and certainly no expressions of regret. They were likely too busy scrambling to pay off their newly acquired restaurant debt to orchestrate their next attack. But while the family group chat remained dead quiet, the reality of military life was moving forward with absolute certainty. Jasmine received her official deployment orders. There was no magical intervention, no last-minute reassignment to a comfortable office chair in Washington. The Department of the Army ordered Second Lieutenant Jasmine Vance to report directly to a mechanized infantry brigade at Fort Stewart. The reality of her situation must have crashed down on her like a physical blow. She was going to be stationed in the sweltering mosquito-infested swamps of coastal Georgia. She would be sleeping in canvas tents during field training exercises, waking up at 4 in the morning to run in the mud and managing heavy armored vehicles. It was a grueling, unforgiving environment designed to break weak spirits and forge actual leaders. Jasmine had spent her entire life being shielded from discomfort, and now she was staring down the barrel of 3 years of relentless physical and mental exhaustion. The panic inside their household must have been absolute. Jasmine possessed zero ability to handle real military work, and Liam was equally desperate. His cybersecurity business was continuing its rapid descent into bankruptcy, and having his wife suddenly shipped off to an active infantry unit shattered their illusion of a glamorous high society military lifestyle. They needed a way out, and they needed it immediately. Their massive financial debts were closing in, and Jasmine was likely threatening to quit the military entirely, which would completely humiliate Liam's legacy-obsessed father. In a moment of sheer unadulterated desperation, Liam decided to play the hero. He convinced himself that his rudimentary knowledge of defense contracting software and his father's outdated connections gave him the ability to manipulate the system. He believed he was smarter than the United States government. Operating from his home office, Liam used a basic virtual private network to access the Department of Defense personnel routing portal. He drafted a highly irregular expedited transfer request, effectively attempting to reassign Jasmine from the infantry brigade at Fort Stewart to a highly coveted administrative billet at the Pentagon. But a transfer of that magnitude required the endorsement of a flag officer. It required a general to bypass the standard assignment protocols. Liam, operating under a delusion of technical superiority, generated a fraudulent digital endorsement. He typed in my full name, my exact rank, and attached it to the transfer request, forging a digital signature from Brigadier General Kendra to authorize his wife's escape from reality. He submitted the form, likely leaning back in his chair, genuinely believing he had just successfully hacked the United States military to save his wife. Exactly 4 milliseconds later, a massive red alert flashed across a monitor inside the most secure building on the planet. I was sitting in a highly secured, sensitive, compartmented information facility, commonly known as a SCIF, deep inside the Cyber Command sector of the Pentagon. The room was a vault of solid steel and acoustic dampening foam, completely isolated from any external cellular or wireless signals. The air conditioning hummed at a freezing temperature to keep the massive server banks operating efficiently. I was in the middle of reviewing a classified threat assessment regarding a foreign state-sponsored hacking syndicate when my lead aide, Captain Miller, approached my glass desk. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, a true professional, but there was a distinct sharpness in his eyes. "General, we just caught a localized anomaly on the personnel routing servers," Captain Miller reported, handing me a thick manila folder containing the printed digital logs. "The automated security protocols flagged a priority transfer request submitted under your name. The digital signature is a complete forgery." I took the folder and opened it, my eyes scanning the meticulously tracked data. Cyber Command did not just monitor foreign threats. We built the architecture that protected the internal network of the entire military infrastructure. The system had instantly recognized that the cryptographic keys required for a general's digital signature were missing. Furthermore, the automated trace had completely bypassed Liam's cheap commercial VPN in less than a second. I looked at the IP address printed on the paper. It traced directly back to a residential router registered in Liam's name at his suburban home. I stared at the pathetic, sloppy forgery. I did not feel angry. I felt a cold, calculating sense of finality. Liam and Jasmine had just crossed an irreversible line. This was no longer a petty family dispute over Thanksgiving dinner, or a childish argument on a parade field. Forging the signature of a federal flag officer to manipulate military deployment orders was a severe felony. It was a federal crime that carried mandatory prison time and a guaranteed dishonorable discharge. Instead of quietly squashing the attempt and burying their stupidity to protect the family name, I decided to let the system execute exactly as designed. I closed the folder and handed it back to Captain Miller. Initiate a formal military inquiry. I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute authority in the quiet SCIF. Draft an official summons. I want Second Lieutenant Jasmine Vance and civilian contractor Liam Vance to report to my office at 0900 hours this Friday. Flag her command so she cannot leave the state. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky hanging over Washington, D.C. I sat behind the expansive glass desk in my primary office on the E-ring of the Pentagon. The E-ring was the outermost corridor of the massive building reserved entirely for the highest-ranking military officials and the Secretary of Defense. The massive windows behind me offered a commanding view of the Potomac River, but my attention was focused entirely on the heavy oak doors leading to my suite. Down in the main visitor center, my family was receiving the reality check of a lifetime. When the official military summons had arrived at their doorstep, they clearly panicked. But instead of realizing the immense legal danger they were in, they fell back into their oldest, most toxic habit. They brought my parents. They arrived at the Pentagon with Jerome and Yvonne in tow, treating a federal criminal inquiry like a parent-teacher conference. Their plan was incredibly transparent. They expected to ambush me. They planned to use Yvonne's weaponized guilt and Jerome's explosive temper to emotionally manipulate me into officially signing the transfer paperwork, thereby covering up Liam's crime and saving the family from a public scandal. They genuinely thought they could just walk into my office and yell at me until I submitted. They had absolutely no concept of the fortress they were trying to penetrate. Their arrogance was systematically dismantled the second they stepped through the outer doors of the Pentagon. They were immediately intercepted by heavily armed Pentagon Force Protection Agency officers. They were not allowed to simply ask for directions. Jasmine, despite wearing her uniform, was stripped of her military ID while they verified her summons. Liam, Jerome, and Yvonne were treated as uncleared civilian threats. They were forced to surrender their cell phones, their smartwatches, and every piece of electronics they carried. They were pushed through advanced millimeter wave scanners and subjected to rigorous physical pat-downs. Captain Miller later informed me that Jerome had attempted to raise his voice at a security guard demanding to be taken directly to his daughter. The guard had placed a hand on his holster and flatly informed Jerome that one more outburst would result in his immediate detention in a federal holding cell. The patriarch of the family was instantly silenced, terrified by the cold, unblinking authority of the federal government. Once they were cleared for entry, they were not allowed to walk freely. They were flanked by 2 armed military police officers and escorted through the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon. As they walked deeper into the building, the sheer scale of the military apparatus began to crush them. They passed generals, admirals, and top-level intelligence directors walking the halls with purposeful intensity. They watched high-ranking officers stop and clear the way for the security detail, assuming my family were high-value targets being escorted to a secure briefing. By the time they reached the heavily guarded E-ring, their illusion of control was completely eradicated. They were not in a restaurant. They were not in their suburban living room. They were deep inside the nerve center of the global military, completely surrounded by the absolute power of the world I controlled. The heavy oak doors to my office suite finally swung open. Captain Miller stepped inside, standing sharply at attention. "General, your 9 o'clock appointments have arrived." "Send them in," I replied, not bothering to stand up from my chair. My family filed into the massive, pristine office. They looked incredibly small. Jasmine was trembling in her uniform, her eyes darting nervously around the room, taking in the classified safes, the multiple secure phone lines, and the imposing flags standing behind my desk. Liam was sweating through his expensive suit, his face completely pale. Jerome and Yvonne followed closely behind them, looking like terrified tourists who had accidentally wandered onto a live firing range. They stood awkwardly in front of my desk. There were no chairs offered. I let them stand in silence for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the heavy, intimidating atmosphere of the Pentagon to completely break whatever remaining resolve they had brought with them. The trap had closed. They had willingly walked directly into the lion's den, and it was time to show them exactly how sharp my teeth were. The silence in my office was heavy and absolute, but it did not last long. Yvonne could never tolerate a room where she was not actively controlling the narrative. The sheer intimidation of the Pentagon had temporarily suppressed her, but her desperate need to assert dominance quickly overrode her common sense. She slammed her expensive designer handbag down onto one of my leather guest chairs and marched right up to the edge of my glass desk. "What is the meaning of this?" Kendra Yvonne demanded, her voice shrill and echoing harshly against the acoustic paneling of the room. "How dare you send armed military police to our hotel? How dare you drag your father and me into this building like we are common criminals? We are your family. You are supposed to protect us, not parade us through security checkpoints to satisfy your massive ego. Jasmine is your sister. She called you for a simple favor regarding her deployment, and instead of helping her like a decent human being, you orchestrate this ridiculous power trip. I am demanding that you fix her orders right now so we can all go home and put this ugly situation behind us." I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I simply leaned back in my high-backed leather chair and looked at the woman who had spent 35 years trying to make me feel small. She was standing in the nerve center of United States Cyber Command, screaming about family loyalty, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively advocating for federal treason. I slowly reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder Captain Miller had handed me 2 days prior. I placed it squarely in the center of the glass desk. I opened the cover, revealing the stark black and white printouts of the digital security logs. "I did not orchestrate a power trip, Mother," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, clinical register that instantly froze the remaining bravado in the room. "I orchestrated a federal inquiry. Because 3 days ago, someone logged into the Department of Defense personnel routing network and attempted to manipulate military deployment orders." Yvonne crossed her arms, rolling her eyes. "So what?" She scoffed dismissively. "Liam just tried to expedite the paperwork since you refused to help your own sister. It is an administrative shortcut. Do not be so dramatic." "It is not a shortcut," I corrected her, my gaze shifting away from my mother and locking directly onto Liam. Liam looked as though he was going to be physically sick. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling at his sides. He knew exactly what was in that folder. "It is a Class A felony." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Liam used a cheap commercial virtual private network to access a secured military portal. He then drafted a fraudulent transfer request to pull Jasmine out of her mechanized infantry unit at Fort Stewart and place her in an administrative billet here at the Pentagon. But he knew a transfer of that magnitude required the authorization of a flag officer. So Liam decided to forge a digital endorsement. He generated a signature using my full name and my exact rank, attempting to use my authority to bypass the United States Army." Jerome took a sudden, sharp breath, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his thick skull. He looked at Liam with wide, terrified eyes. "You forged a general's signature?" Jerome whispered, the sheer horror evident in his tone. Liam opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a lie. "It was not me," Liam stammered, his voice cracking violently. "Your system must have made a mistake. Anyone could have typed your name into that box. You cannot prove I did it. We were at a coffee shop. Someone could have hacked my laptop." I let out a short, humorless laugh. I reached across the desk and tapped a specific line of text highlighted in bright yellow ink. "You do not lie to the commanding officer of Cyber Command about digital footprints, Liam," I stated flatly. "My automated security protocols caught the missing cryptographic keys the exact millisecond your fraudulent form hit our servers. We bypassed your pathetic commercial VPN in less than half a second. This document right here contains the exact timestamp of the crime, down to the microsecond. And right next to it is the origin IP address. It does not map back to a coffee shop. It maps directly to the residential broadband router registered under your exact name located in the living room of your suburban home. We even have the MAC address of the specific laptop you used to commit the crime." Liam's knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the back of the leather guest chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpet. The illusion of his technical superiority was completely shattered. He was a child playing with matches who had just accidentally burned down a federal building. I turned my attention to Jasmine. The golden child was entirely pale. The shiny gold bars of her second lieutenant rank looked like a cruel joke pinned to her collar. She was staring at the folder on my desk as if it were a live grenade. "Do you understand what is happening right now, Lieutenant?" I asked, my tone entirely devoid of sisterly affection. "You are an active duty military officer. You are complicit in a conspiracy to defraud the Department of Defense and dodge a lawful deployment order. You are facing an Article 15 at a minimum. However, given the severity of forging a flag officer's signature, I am highly inclined to recommend a general court-martial. You are looking at a dishonorable discharge before your career even begins stripping you of all military benefits forever. And that is if you avoid serving time in a federal military penitentiary." Jasmine let out a choked, terrified sob. She looked at our parents, her eyes wide with absolute panic. "Mom, do something!" Jasmine begged, her voice trembling violently. "Tell her she cannot do this to me. Tell her to make it go away." Yvonne opened her mouth, preparing to launch into another screaming fit of emotional manipulation, but the words died in her throat. She looked at my face, realizing for the very first time that I was completely untouchable. The guilt trips, the shaming, the loud public tantrums, none of her usual weapons had any effect in this room. She was completely powerless, standing in the shadow of a daughter she had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. "And as for you, Liam," I said, shifting my gaze back to the terrified civilian contractor, "you are not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but you are subject to federal law. Forging federal documents, impersonating a military officer, and attempting to manipulate troop deployments carry mandatory minimum sentences in a federal civilian prison. I am handing this entire dossier over to the Department of Justice this afternoon. Your business is already bankrupt. By next week, your entire life will be over." The color completely left their faces. The heavy, crushing reality of their impending destruction settled over the room like a thick blanket of snow. They had walked into the Pentagon, expecting to yell at me until I fixed their problems. Instead, they had walked directly into their own execution. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors to my office burst open with a violent crash. Captain Miller was instantly on his feet, stepping into the doorway to block the intruder, his hand resting cautiously on his duty belt. "Sir, you cannot enter this suite without clearance." Miller barked, his voice loud and authoritative. But the man pushing his way into my office did not care about clearance. He shoved past my aide with the reckless, unearned confidence of a man who believed the rules simply did not apply to him. It was Richard Vance, Liam's father, and a retired colonel of the United States Army. He was a tall, heavy-set, older white man, wearing a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my parents made in a year. His face was flushed red with anger, and he radiated the arrogant assumption that he still ran the military hierarchy. "Stand down!" Captain Richard bellowed, swatting Miller's arm away as if the highly trained officer were an annoying mosquito. "I am a retired colonel, and I do not need a babysitter to speak to the staff." I raised my right hand, gesturing for Captain Miller to step back. "It is all right, Captain," I said calmly. "Let the colonel inside. Secure the door behind him." Miller immediately complied, stepping back into the hallway and pulling the heavy oak doors shut with a solid, echoing thud. Richard Vance stormed into the center of the room, completely ignoring my parents and Jasmine. He marched directly up to his trembling son, grabbed Liam by the shoulder, and gave him a rough, reassuring shake. Then Richard turned his furious gaze directly onto me. He did not salute. He did not offer the proper greeting of the day. He simply planted his hands on his hips and glared at me with the absolute entitlement of the old boys' club. "Listen to me very carefully." Kendra Richards started deliberately using my first name to completely disrespect my rank and position. "I know exactly what you think you are doing here. My son called me in a panic this morning, telling me you were trying to frame him for some ridiculous cybercrime just to settle a petty family grudge. You think because they pinned a shiny silver star on your collar that you suddenly own the world. You think you can bully my boy and ruin my daughter-in-law's career just to make yourself feel important. I did not flinch. I did not interrupt him. I sat perfectly still behind my glass desk, analyzing every single word dripping from his arrogant mouth. "You are a young woman who got promoted entirely too fast," Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension and deeply ingrained prejudice. "You do not understand how things actually work in this building. This military is built on legacy. It is built on relationships. It is built on men like me who shed blood in the sand while you were still playing with dolls. I spent 30 years building a network in Washington. I play golf with 3-star generals. I have the personal cell phone numbers of half the Armed Services Committee on speed dial." Richard leaned forward, planting both of his hands flat on my glass desk, invading my space in a classic outdated intimidation tactic. He lowered his voice into a dangerous, threatening growl. "You are going to take whatever fraudulent paperwork you printed out, and you are going to run it right through that shredder in the corner. You are going to authorize Jasmine's transfer to the Pentagon immediately, and you are going to drop this entire ridiculous investigation into my son. Because if you do not do exactly what I tell you to do right now, I will make 2 phone calls. Just 2. And by tomorrow morning, your career will be completely over. They will strip you of that star, they will revoke your security clearance, and they will throw you out of this building so fast your head will spin. Do you understand how the real world works now, little girl?" I let the silence stretch out after his pathetic speech. I looked at the family standing behind him. Yvonne and Jerome were visibly breathing sighs of relief. The color was slowly returning to Liam's face. Jasmine had actually stopped crying. They were looking at Richard Vance as if he were a white knight riding in on a shining horse to save them from the evil dragon. They genuinely believed that this loud, arrogant, retired old man possessed the power to completely override a sitting brigadier general inside her own command center. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his anger. I simply looked at Richard Vance with a cold, terrifying smile that caused the arrogant smirk on his face to falter for the very first time. I let that cold, terrifying smile linger on my face for a few long seconds, watching the absolute certainty in Richard Vance's eyes begin to waver. He was waiting for me to apologize, to scramble for the paper shredder, to bow to his outdated authority. He stood there panting heavily, his face flushed with the exertion of his own arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just walked onto a battlefield entirely unarmed. "Colonel Vance," I began, my voice carrying the lethal, unhurried calm of a precision drone strike. "You are absolutely right about one thing. This building is built on intelligence, but your intelligence is severely out of date. You think your golf buddies on the Armed Services Committee can save you. You think your 3-star contacts are going to risk their own stars to protect a civilian contractor? Let me explain to you exactly how the real world works now." I reached across the pristine surface of my glass desk and pulled a thick red-bordered dossier toward me. It was stamped with the highest level of top-secret classification. I slowly flipped the heavy cover open, revealing hundreds of pages of meticulously gathered digital evidence. For the past 6 months, I stayed locking my eyes entirely on Richard. My cyber division has been conducting a highly classified multi-agency federal investigation into Vance Solutions. Your company has not just been underperforming, Colonel. You have been actively hemorrhaging classified Department of Defense data to foreign adversaries due to severe willful negligence. Richard's jaw actually dropped. The aggressive posture he had taken leaning over my desk instantly evaporated. He stood up straight, taking a weak, unsteady step backward. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, the booming authority completely stripped from his voice. "My company is secure. My son runs the daily operations. We use the best protocols. Your son is an idiot." I corrected him sharply, not breaking eye contact. "Your son bypassed mandatory security patches to cut operational costs. Your internal servers were penetrated 4 months ago by a state-sponsored hacking collective. They have been siphoning encrypted defense schematics right under your nose. When my automated systems detected the breach, we did not notify you. We allowed the breach to remain open in a controlled sandbox environment. so we could trace the exact level of your company's absolute incompetence. You have violated 17 separate federal compliance laws. Liam let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper from the back of the room. He sank into one of the leather chairs, burying his face in his hands. He knew I was telling the absolute truth. "You cannot prove any of that," Richard whispered, but his shaking hands betrayed his terror. "You are just trying to scare us. I am going to call the Inspector General." I ignored his empty threat. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy black fountain pen. I slid a single officially sealed document from the back of the dossier and placed it perfectly in the center of the glass desk. "This is an executive order of revocation," I explained smoothly, uncapping the pen. "As the commanding officer of United States Cyber Command, I possess the unilateral authority to immediately terminate any security clearance posing an active threat to national security." I pressed the nib of the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name with a fluid, practiced motion. I capped the pen and pushed the document toward the edge of the desk. "I am officially revoking Vance Solutions' Department of Defense security clearance on the spot," I announced. That signature instantly freezes every single federal contract you hold. It freezes your operational bank accounts. As we speak, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation are walking into your corporate headquarters in Virginia to seize your servers and padlock your doors. Your legacy is gone, Richard. Your wealth is entirely wiped out by one stroke of my pen. You are not going to call your political connections, because by lunchtime today, nobody in Washington will ever answer your phone calls again. Richard Vance stared at the signature on the paper as if it were a death warrant. The fight completely drained out of his body. His knees gave out and he collapsed heavily into the guest chair next to his sobbing son. The old boys' club had just been violently dismantled by the very woman he had called a little girl just 3 minutes prior. He put his head in his hands, staring blankly at the carpet, realizing his entire life's work had just been reduced to ashes. The profound, suffocating reality of the situation finally hit my parents. Jerome and Yvonne stood frozen near the door, watching the powerful, wealthy family they had worshipped completely disintegrate before their eyes. The golden ticket was gone. Liam was not a millionaire defense contractor. He was a broke, incompetent criminal facing federal prison time. Jasmine was not a rising military star. She was a disgraced officer facing a court-martial. Suddenly, Yvonne let out a horrific, gut-wrenching wail. It was not her usual theatrical cry designed for manipulation. It was the raw, primal scream of a woman watching her entire world collapse. She pushed past Jasmine and threw herself at my desk, gripping the edge of the glass so hard her fingers turned white. "Kendra, you cannot do this." Yvonne begged, tears streaming down her face, completely abandoning all her previous pride and arrogance. "Please, I am begging you. You have to undo this. You have to give them the clearance back. You do not understand what is happening." I sat perfectly still, watching her unravel. "I understand exactly what is happening, Mother. I am executing my sworn duty to protect this country." "No, you do not understand." Yvonne sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing off the walls. "Your father and I, we have no money left. We gave it all to them. When Liam's company started having cash flow problems last year, we wanted to help maintain their image. We wanted Jasmine to have the beautiful house and the expensive cars. We took out a massive second mortgage on our house. We drained your father's entire retirement fund. We gave Liam hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep the business afloat until his next Pentagon contract came through." Jerome looked like he was going to vomit. He leaned heavily against the oak door, closing his eyes in absolute shame. The truth was finally out in the open. The lavish, wealthy lifestyle my family had spent the last year flaunting in my face was entirely financed by crippling debt. They had bet their home, their retirement, and their entire future on a fraudulent contractor and a spoiled golden child. "If Liam goes bankrupt, we lose everything," Yvonne cried, dropping to her knees on the thick carpet, her hands still clutching the edge of my desk. "The bank is going to foreclose on our house next month. We will be out on the street. Please, Kendra, you are rich. You have all this power. You can save us. You have to save your family. I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years telling me I was worthless. I looked at the father who had shoved me out of photographs. I looked at the sister who had treated me like a servant. And I looked at the brother-in-law who had thrown a crumpled $20 bill at my chest. They had finally reached the absolute bottom, and they were desperately reaching up, begging the daughter they had discarded to pull them out of the grave they had dug for themselves. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no lingering desire for their approval. The psychological chains that had bound me to this toxic family for over 3 decades simply dissolved into dust. I pressed a small silver button under the lip of my desk. The heavy oak doors immediately swung open. Captain Miller stepped inside, followed by 4 heavily armed military police officers. I looked at the pathetic group of people weeping on my office floor. "You are dismissed," I said, my voice cold, final, and entirely empty of any emotion. General Captain Miller asked, gesturing toward the sobbing family. "Escort these civilians out of the Pentagon," I ordered, turning my attention to my computer monitor. "And ensure their names are permanently added to the base denial roster. They are never to step foot on federal property again." The military police moved in with swift, uncompromising efficiency. They hauled Richard Vance to his feet. They grabbed Liam by the arms, dragging the terrified contractor toward the door. Jasmine screamed, fighting against the officers, as they stripped the temporary visitor badge from her uniform, her cries echoing down the pristine hallway of the E-ring. Yvonne reached out toward me, screaming my name over and over again, begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. I did not look up. I listened to their screams fade away as the heavy oak doors clicked firmly shut, plunging my office back into absolute peaceful silence. 6 months later, the crisp, cool air of early autumn carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant salty breeze off the Potomac River. I stood on the expansive front porch of my beautiful historic townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with old cobblestone streets and massive oak trees. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the peaceful morning wash over me as I brought a ceramic mug of black coffee to my lips. My cell phone, resting on the wrought iron patio table beside me, suddenly buzzed against the metal. The screen lit up, displaying a transcribed voicemail from a number I had not saved, but one I recognized instantly. It was Yvonne. The transcription software captured the frantic, angry tone perfectly. "Kendra, how could you do this to us? The bank locked the doors today. We are moving into a miserable 1-bedroom apartment. Liam is facing a federal indictment, and Jasmine got a dishonorable discharge. She works at a grocery store now. You ruined our lives. You are a monster. I hope you are happy." I read the text with a profound sense of detachment. I did not feel a spike of anxiety in my chest. I did not feel the familiar heavy weight of her weaponized guilt. I simply picked up the phone, pressed my thumb against the screen, and deleted the voicemail. I tapped the contact settings and blocked the number forever. The last remaining thread connecting me to that toxic past was permanently severed. I took another sip of my coffee, the warm, bitter liquid grounding me in the present moment. A sleek, black, armored government SUV turned the corner and glided silently to a stop right in front of my brick pathway. The heavy door opened, and Captain Miller stepped out onto the sidewalk. He was dressed in his immaculate dress uniform, his posture completely rigid. He looked up at the porch, his eyes meeting mine, and snapped a flawless, sharp salute. "Good morning," General Miller called out, his voice carrying genuine respect. "We have the Joint Chiefs waiting for your briefing in the SCIF." I set my empty coffee mug down on the patio table. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blue uniform jacket, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the silver stars resting on my shoulders. I returned his salute with crisp precision. "Good morning, Captain," I replied, walking down the brick steps toward the waiting vehicle. "Let us go to work." I stepped into the back of the SUV, the heavy armored door closing behind me with a solid, comforting thud. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the morning traffic toward the Pentagon, I looked out the tinted window. I was completely free. I had not relied on legacy nepotism or the conditional love of a broken family. Everything I had, every ounce of power and respect, was entirely built by my own two hands in the absolute dark. I was no longer the discarded daughter hiding in a trench coat. I was the architect of my own empire, and the view from the top was absolutely beautiful. The greatest lesson I learned is that your true worth is never determined by the limitations others place on you. My family spent decades trying to convince me I was a failure because I did not fit their narrative. But true power does not need a loud audience. Genuine success never requires validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. The most powerful thing you can do is work hard in absolute silence and let your undeniable results speak for themselves. You do not owe toxic people a seat at your table just because you share a bloodline. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace and build your own success? Share your story in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe for more empowering stories about claiming your worth.